The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. The term Cold War is used because there was no large-scale fighting directly between the two superpowers, but they each supported opposing sides in major regional conflicts known as proxy wars. The conflict was based on the ideological and geopolitical struggle for global influence by these two superpowers, following their temporary alliance and victory against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 1945. Aside from the nuclear arsenal development and conventional military deployment, the struggle for dominance was expressed via indirect means such as psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns, espionage, far-reaching embargoes, rivalry at sports events, and technological competitions such as the space race. The Western Bloc was led by the United States as well as a number of other First World nations that were generally liberal democratic, but tied to a network of often Third World authoritarian states, most of which were the European powers' former colonies. The Eastern Bloc was led by the Soviet Union and its Communist Party, which had an influence across the Second World and was also tied to a network of authoritarian states. The Soviet Union had a command economy and installed similarly totalitarian regimes in its satellite states. The U.S. government supported anti-communist and right-wing governments and uprisings across the world, while the Soviet government funded left-wing parties and revolutions around the world. As nearly all the colonial states achieved independence in the period from 1945 to 1960, many became Third World battlefields in the Cold War. The first phase of the Cold War began shortly after the end of World War II in 1945. The United States and its Western European allies sought to strengthen their bonds and use the policy of containment against Soviet influence. They accomplished this most notably through the formation of NATO, which was essentially a defensive agreement in 1949. The Soviet Union countered with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, which had similar results with the Eastern Bloc. As by 1955, the Soviet Union already had an armed presence and political domination all over its eastern satellite states, the pact has been long considered superfluous. Although nominally a defensive alliance, the pact's primary function was to safeguard the Soviet Union's hegemony over its Eastern European satellites, with the pact's only direct military actions having been the invasions of its own member states to keep them from breaking away. In 1961, Soviet-dominated East Germany constructed the Berlin Wall to prevent the citizens of East Berlin from fleeing to free and prosperous West Berlin, part of U.S. allied West Germany. Major crises of this phase included the 1948-1949 Berlin Blockade, the 1945-1949 Chinese Communist Revolution, the 1953 Korean War, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, the 1956 Suez Crisis, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1962 Cuban Missile. The U.S. and the USSR competed for influence in Latin America, the Middle East, and the decolonizing states of Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, a new phase began that saw the Sino-Soviet split between China and the Soviet Union complicate relations within the communist sphere, leading to a series of border confrontations, while France, a Western Bloc state, began to demand greater autonomy of action. The USSR invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress the 1968 Prague Spring, while the U.S. experienced internal turmoil from the civil rights movement and opposition to the Vietnam War. In the 1960s, 1970s, an international peace movement took root among citizens around the world. Movements against nuclear weapons testing and for nuclear disarmament took place, with large anti-war protests. By the 1970s, both sides had started making allowances for peace and security, ushering in a period of detente that saw the strategic arms limitation talks in the U.S., opening relations with the People's Republic of China as a strategic counterweight to the U.S. A number of self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninist governments were formed in the second half of the 1970s in developing countries, including Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Afghanistan, and Nicaragua. Detente collapsed at the end of the decade with the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War in 1979. The early 1980s was another period of elevated tension. The United States increased diplomatic, military, and economic pressures on the Soviet Union, at a time when it was already suffering from economic stagnation. In the mid-1980s, the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced the liberalizing reforms of glasnost, openness, c. 1985, and perestroika, reorganization 1987, and ended Soviet involvement in Afghanistan in 1989. Pressures for national sovereignty grew stronger in Eastern Europe, and Gorbachev refused to militarily support the communist governments any longer. In 1989, the fall of the Iron Curtain, after the Pan-European picnic and a peaceful wave of revolutions, with the exception of Romania and Afghanistan, overthrew almost all of the Marxist-Leninist regimes of the Eastern Bloc. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union itself lost control in the country and was banned following an abortive coup attempt in August 1991. This in turn led to the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991 and the collapse of communist governments across much of Africa and Asia. The Russian Federation became the Soviet Union's successor state, while many of the other republics emerged from the USSR's collapse as fully independent post-Soviet states. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower. The Cold War and its events have left a significant legacy. It is often referred to in popular culture, especially with themes of espionage and the threat of nuclear warfare. For subsequent history, see International Relations since 1989. At the end of World War II, English writer George Orwell used Cold War as a general term in his essay You and the Atomic Bomb, published 19 October 1945 in the British newspaper Tribune. Contemplating a world living in the shadow of the threat of nuclear warfare, Orwell looked at James Burnham's predictions of a polarized world, writing, "Looking at the world as a whole, the drift for many decades has been not towards anarchy but towards the reimposition of slavery. James Burnham's theory has been much discussed, but few people have yet considered its ideological implications. That is, the kind of worldview, the kind of beliefs, and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state which was at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of cold war with its neighbors." In The Observer of 10 March 1946, Orwell wrote, "After the Moscow Conference last December, Russia began to make a Cold War on Britain and the British Empire." The first use of the term to describe the specific post-war geopolitical confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States came in a speech by Bernard Baruch, an influential advisor to Democratic presidents, on 16 April 1947. The speech, written by a journalist, Herbert Bayard Swope, proclaimed, "Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a Cold War." Newspaper columnist Walter Lippmann gave the term wide currency with his book The Cold War. When asked in 1947 about the source of the term, Lippmann traced it to a French term from the 1930s, la guerre froide. While most historians trace the origins of the Cold War to the period immediately following World War II, some argue that it began with the 1917 October Revolution in the Russian Republic when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian Provisional Government. In World War I, the British, French, and Russian empires had composed the major Allied powers from the start, and the U.S. joined them as a self-styled associated power in April 1917. After the Bolsheviks' seizure of power, the Bloody Red Terror was initiated to shut down all opposition, both perceived and real. In December, the Bolsheviks signed an armistice with the Central Powers, though by February 1918, fighting had resumed. In March, the Soviets ended involvement in the war and signed the separate peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk. As a result, German armies advanced rapidly across the borderlands. The Allies responded with an economic blockade against the new Russian regime. In the eyes of some allies, Russia now was helping Germany to win the war by freeing up 1 million German soldiers for the Western Front and by relinquishing much of Russia's food supply, industrial base, fuel supplies, and communications with Western Europe. According to historian Spencer Tucker, the Allies felt the treaty was the ultimate betrayal of the Allied cause and sowed the seeds for the Cold War. With Brest-Litovsk, the specter of German domination in Eastern Europe threatened to become reality, and the Allies now began to think seriously about military intervention and proceeded to step up their economic warfare against the Bolsheviks. Some Bolsheviks saw Russia as only the first step, planning to incite revolutions against capitalism in every Western country, but the need for peace with Germany led Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin away from this position. In 1918, Britain provided money and troops to support the White Movement, a loose confederation of anti-Bolshevik forces. This policy was spearheaded by Minister of War Winston Churchill, a committed anti-communist. A long and bloody civil war ensued between the Reds and the Whites, starting in 1917 and ending in 1923 with the Reds' victory. It included foreign intervention, the execution of the former emperor and his family in the famine of 1921, which killed about 5 million people. Soviet Russia sought to reconquer all newly independent nations of the former empire, although their success was limited. Estonia, Finland, Latvia, and Lithuania all repelled Soviet invasions, while Ukraine, Belarus, as a result of the Polish-Soviet War, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia were occupied by the Red Army. Under U.S. President Herbert Hoover, very large-scale food relief was distributed to Europe after the war through the American Relief Administration. In 1921, to ease the devastating famine in the Russian SFAIS that was triggered by the Soviet government's war communism policies, the ARA, Director in Europe Walter Lyman Brown began negotiating with the Russian People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Maxim Litvinov, in Riga, Latvia, at that time not yet annexed by the USSR. An agreement was reached on August 21, 1921, and an additional implementation agreement was signed by Brown and People's Commissar for Foreign Trade Leonid Krasin on December 30, 1921. The U.S. Congress appropriated $20 million for relief under the Russian Famine Relief Act of late 1921. Hoover strongly detested Bolshevism and felt the American aid would demonstrate the superiority of Western capitalism and thus help contain the spread of communism at its peak. The AR employed 300 Americans, more than 120,000 Russians, and fed 10.5 million people daily. Its Russian operations were headed by Colonel William N. Haskell. The medical division of the ARAA functioned from November 1921 to June 1921 to June 1923 and helped overcome the typhus epidemic then ravaging Russia. The famine relief operations ran in parallel with much smaller Mennonite, Jewish, and Quaker famine relief operations in Russia. The ARAU's operations in Russia were shut down on June 15, 1923, after it was discovered that Russia under Lenin renewed the export of grain. Western powers proceeded diplomatically isolated the Soviet government. Lenin stated that Russia was surrounded by a hostile capitalist encirclement, and he viewed diplomacy as a weapon to keep Soviet enemies divided. He set up an organization to promote sister revolutions worldwide, the Comintern. It failed everywhere. It failed badly when it tried to start revolutions in Germany, its province of Bavaria, and Hungary. The failures led to an inward turn by Moscow. Leaders of American foreign policy remained convinced that the Soviet Union, which was founded by Soviet Russia in 1922, was a hostile threat to American values. Republican Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes rejected recognition, telling labor union leaders that those in control of Moscow have not given up their original purpose of destroying existing governments wherever they can do so throughout the world. Under President Calvin Coolidge, Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg warned that the Kremlin's international agency, the Communist International Comintern, was aggressively planning subversion against other nations, including the United States, to overthrow the existing order. Herbert Hoover in 1919 warned Woodrow Wilson that we cannot even remotely recognize this murderous tyranny without stimulating action as to radicalism in every country in Europe, and without transgressing on every national ideal of our own. Inside the U.S. State Department, the Division of Eastern European Affairs by 1924 was dominated by Robert F. Kelly, a dedicated opponent of communism who trained a generation of specialists, including George Kennan and Charles Bolin. Britain and other Western powers, unlike the United States, did business and sometimes recognized the new Soviet Union. Outside Washington, there was some American support for renewed relationships, especially in terms of technology. Henry Ford, committed to the belief that international trade was the best way to avoid warfare, used his Ford Motor Company to build a truck industry and introduce tractors into Russia. Architect Albert Kahn became a consultant for all industrial construction in the Soviet Union in 1930. By 1933, the American business community, as well as newspaper editors, were calling for diplomatic recognition. President Franklin D. Roosevelt used presidential authority to normalize relations in November 1933. However, there was no progress on the Tsarist debts Washington wanted Moscow to repay. Expectations of expanded trade proved unrealistic. Historians Justus D. Denecke and Mark A. Stoller note that both nations were soon disillusioned by the accord. Roosevelt named William Bullitt as ambassador from 1933 to 1936. Bullitt arrived in Moscow with high hopes for Soviet-American relations, but his view of the Soviet leadership soured on closer inspection. By the end of his tenure, Bullitt was openly hostile to the Soviet government, and he remained an outspoken anti-communist for the rest of his life. In the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin had worked with Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov to promote popular fronts with capitalist parties and governments to oppose fascism, although their primary enemy was the so-called social fascism of rival socialist parties, which in part paved the way for the rise of the Nazis in Germany. In 1939, after attempts to form a military alliance with Britain and France against Germany failed, the Soviet Union made a dramatic shift towards Nazi Germany. Almost a year after Britain and France had concluded the Munich Agreement with Germany, the Soviet Union made agreements with Germany as well, both militarily and economically during extensive talks. Unlike the case of Britain and France, the Soviet Union's agreement with Germany, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed on 23 August 1939, included a secret protocol that paved the way for the Soviet invasion of Eastern European states and occupation of their territories. The pact made possible the Soviet occupation of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Bessarabia, northern Bukovina, and the Herzegovina region, and eastern Poland in late November 1939, unable to coerce the Republic of Finland by diplomatic means into moving its border 25 kilometers 16 miles back from Leningrad, 25 kilometers 16 miles back from. Stalin ordered the invasion of Finland. On 14 December 1939, the Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations for invading Finland. In June 1940, the Soviet Union forcibly annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Germany broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invaded the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941, starting what is known in Russia and some other post-Soviet states as the Great Patriotic War. The Red Army stopped the seemingly invincible German army at the Battle of Moscow. The Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from late 1942 to early 1943, dealt a severe blow to Germany from which they never fully recovered and became a turning point in the war. After Stalingrad, Soviet forces drove through Eastern Europe to Berlin before Germany surrendered in 1945. The German army suffered 80 of its military deaths in the Eastern Front. Though operational cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union was notably less than that between other Allied powers, the United States nevertheless provided the Soviet Union with huge quantities of weapons, ships, aircraft, rolling stock, strategic materials, and food through the Lend-Lease program. In total, the U.S. deliveries through Lend-Lease amounted to $11 billion in materials, over 400,000 jeeps and trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles including 7,000 tanks, about 1,386 of which were Mithriles and 4,102 MOM-4 Shermans, 102 MOM-4 Shermans, 11,400 aircraft, or 1,719 of which were Bell P-30. Roughly 17.5 million tons of military equipment, vehicles, industrial supplies, and food were shipped from the Western Hemisphere to the USSR 94s coming from the USS. For comparison, a total of 22 million tons landed in Europe to supply American forces from January 1942 to May 1942 to May 1945. It has been estimated that American deliveries to the USSR through the Persian corridor alone were sufficient, by U.S. Army standards to maintain 60 combat divisions in the line. The USSR, in fulfillment of its agreement with the Allies at the Yalta Conference, broke the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in April 1945, which Japan had been honoring despite their alliance with Germany, and invaded Manchukuo and other Japan controlled territories on 9 August 1945. This conflict ended with a decisive Soviet victory, together with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the U.S., contributing to the unconditional surrender of Japan and the end of World War II. The Allies disagreed about how the European map should look and how borders would be drawn following the war. Each side held dissimilar ideas regarding the establishment and maintenance of post-war security. Some scholars contend that all the Western Allies desired a security system in which democratic governments were established as widely as possible, permitting countries to peacefully resolve differences through international organizations. Others note that the Atlantic powers were divided in their vision of the new post-war world. Roosevelt's goals: military victory in both Europe and Asia, the achievement of global American economic supremacy over the British Empire, and the creation of a world peace organization, were more global than Churchill's, which were mainly centered on securing control over the Mediterranean, ensuring the survival of the British Empire, and the independence of Central and Eastern European countries as a buffer between the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom. The Soviet Union sought to dominate the internal affairs of countries in its border regions. During the war, Stalin had created special training centers for communists from different countries so that they could set up secret police forces loyal to Moscow as soon as the Red Army took control. Soviet agents took control of the media, especially radio. They quickly harassed and then banned all independent civic institutions, from youth groups to schools, churches, and rival political parties. Stalin also sought continued peace with Britain and the United States, hoping to focus on internal reconstruction and economic growth. In the American view, Stalin seemed a potential ally in accomplishing their goals, whereas in the British approach, Stalin appeared as the greatest threat to the fulfillment of their agenda. With the Soviets already occupying most of Central and Eastern Europe, Stalin was at an advantage, and the two Western leaders vied for his favors. The differences between Roosevelt and Churchill led to several separate deals with the Soviets. In October 1944, Churchill traveled to Moscow and proposed the Percentages Agreement to divide Europe into respective spheres of influence, including giving Stalin predominance over Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, and Churchill carte blanche over Greece. This proposal was accepted by Stalin. At the Yalta Conference of February 1945, Roosevelt signed a separate deal with Stalin regarding Asia and refused to support Churchill on the issues of Poland and reparations. Roosevelt ultimately approved the Percentage Agreement, but there was still apparently no firm consensus on the framework for a post-war settlement in Europe. At the Second Quebec Conference, a high-level military conference held in Quebec City, 12-16 September 1944, Churchill and Roosevelt reached agreement on a number of matters, including a plan for Germany based on Henry Morgantha Jr.'s original proposal. The memorandum drafted by Churchill provided for eliminating the war-making industries in the Ruhr and the Sauerau, looking forward to converting Germany into a country primarily agricultural and pastoral in its character. However, it no longer included a plan to partition the country into several independent states. On 10 May 1945, President Truman signed the U.S. Occupation Directive JCSCS 1067, which was in effect for over 2 years and was enthusiastically supported by Stalin. It directed the U.S. forces of occupation to take no steps looking toward the economic rehabilitation of Germany. In April 1945, President Roosevelt died and was succeeded by Vice President Harry S. Truman, who distrusted Stalin and turned for advice to an elite group of foreign policy intellectuals. Both Churchill and Truman opposed, among other things, the Soviets' decision to prop up the Lublin government, the Soviet-controlled rival to the Polish government, in Isle of the original Second Polish Republic in London, whose relations with the Soviets had been severed following the Allies' May 1945 victory. The Soviets effectively occupied Central and Eastern Europe, while strong U.S. Allied forces remained in Western Europe. In Germany and Austria, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States established zones of occupation and a loose framework for parceled for power control. The 1945 Allied Conference in San Francisco established the multinational United Nations, UN, for the maintenance of world peace, but the enforcement capacity of its Security Council was effectively paralyzed by the ability of individual members to exercise veto power. Accordingly, the UN was essentially converted into an inactive forum for exchanging polemical rhetoric, and the Soviets regarded it almost exclusively as a propaganda tribune. At the Potsdam Conference, which started in late July 1945 after Germany's surrender, serious differences emerged over the future development of Germany and the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. The Soviets pressed their demand made at Yalta for $20 billion of reparations to be taken from Germany occupation zones. The Americans and British refused to fix a dollar amount for reparations, but they permitted the Soviets to remove some industry from their zones. Moreover, the participants' mounting antipathy and bellicose language served to confirm their suspicions about each other's hostile intentions and to entrench their positions. At this conference, Truman informed Stalin that the United States possessed a powerful new weapon. The U.S. had invited Britain into its atomic bomb project, but kept it secret from the Soviet Union. Stalin was aware that the Americans were working on the atomic bomb via his atomic spies in the West, and he reacted to the news calmly. 1 week after the end of the Potsdam Conference, the U.S. bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Shortly after the attacks, Stalin protested to us officials when Truman offered the Soviets little real influence in occupied Japan. Stalin was reportedly also outraged by the dropping of the bombs, calling them a super barbarity and claiming that the balance has been destroyed. That cannot be. The Truman administration intended to use its ongoing nuclear weapons program to pressure the Soviet Union in international relations. Following the war, the United States and the United Kingdom used military forces in Greece and Korea to remove combat governing regimes and forces seen as communist, under the leadership of Liu Hyung. Working secretly during the Japanese occupation, a network of people's committees throughout Japanese Korea were formed to coordinate the transition to Korean independence. Following the Japanese surrender, on 28 August 1945, these committees formed the Provisional National Government of Korea, naming it the People's Republic of Korea. A couple of weeks later, it was proclaimed on 6 September 1945, as Korea was being divided into two occupation zones, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and the United States occupying the south. In the South, the U.S. military government outlawed the PRK on 12 December 1945. In the North, the Soviet authorities took over the PRK by installing pro-Soviet Korean communists such as Kim Il-sung into positions of power and incorporated it into the political structure of the emerging Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, during the opening stages of World War II. The Soviet Union laid the foundation for the Eastern Soviet Bloc by invading and then annexing several countries into the USSR as Soviet Socialist republics following the agreement with Germany and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. These included Eastern Poland, incorporated into the Byelorussian SSR, and the Ukrainian SSR Latvia, which became the Latvian SSR, Estonia, which became the Estonian SSR Lithuania, which became the Estonian SSR Lithuanian SR. Part of Eastern Finland, which became the Lithuanian SSR later, incorporated in the Russian SFSR, and Eastern Romania, which became the Moldavian SSR. Central and Eastern European territories that the Soviet Army occupied were added to the Eastern Bloc, pursuant to the percentages agreement between Churchill and Stalin, which, however, contained provisions regarding neither Poland nor Czechoslovakia or Germany. The Soviet Union converted the territories it occupied into satellite states such as People's Republic of Bulgaria, 15 September 1946, Romanian People's Republic, 13 April 1948, Hungarian People's Republic, 20 August 1949. Moreover, two further socialist republics with a higher degree of independence from the Soviet Union were also established. People's Republic of Albania, 11 January 1946, Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the Soviet-style regimes that arose in the bloc not only reproduced Soviet command economy, but also adopted the brutal methods employed by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet secret police in order to suppress both real and perceived opposition. In Asia, the Red Army had overrun Manchuria in the last month of the war, and it went on to occupy the large swath of Korean territory located north of the 38th parallel as part of consolidating Stalin's control over the Eastern Bloc. The People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, led by Lavrenti Beria, supervised the establishment of Soviet-style secret police systems in the bloc that were supposed to crush anti-communist resistance. When the slightest stirrings of independence emerged in the bloc, Stalin's strategy matched that of dealing with domestic pre-war rivals. They were removed from power, put on trial, imprisoned, and in some instances executed economically. The U.S. Concentrated on its own recovery, seizing and transferring most of Germany's industrial plants, and it exacted war reparations from East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria using Soviet-dominated joint enterprises. It also instituted trading arrangements deliberately designed to favor the country. Moscow controlled the communist parties that ruled the satellite states, and they followed orders from the Kremlin. Historian Mark Kramer concludes, the net outflow of resources from Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union was approximately $15 billion to $20 billion in the first decade after World War II, an amount roughly equal to the total aid provided by the United States to Western Europe under the Marshall Plan. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was concerned that, given the enormous size of Soviet forces deployed in Europe at the end of the war, and the perception that Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was unreliable, there existed a Soviet threat to Western Europe. After World War II, U.S. officials guided Western European leaders in establishing their own secret security force to prevent subversion in the Western Bloc, which evolved into Operation Gladio. In late February 1946, George F. Kennan's long telegram from Moscow to Washington helped to articulate the U.S. government's increasingly hard line against the Soviets, which would become the basis for U.S. strategy toward the Soviet Union for the duration of the Cold War. The telegram galvanized a policy debate that would eventually shape the Truman administration's Soviet policy. Washington's opposition to the Soviets accumulated after broken promises by Stalin and Molotov concerning Europe and Iran. Following the World War II Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran, the country was occupied by the Red Army in the far north and the British in the south. Iran was used by the United States and British to supply the Soviet Union, and the Allies agreed to withdraw from Iran within 6 months after the cessation of hostilities. However, when this deadline came, the Soviets remained in Iran under the guise of the Azerbaijan People's Government and Kurdish Republic of Mahabad. Shortly thereafter, on 5 March, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. The speech called for an Anglo-American alliance against the Soviets, whom he accused of establishing an Iron Curtain, dividing Europe from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. A week later, on 13 March, Stalin responded vigorously to the speech, saying that Churchill could be compared to Hitler insofar as he advocated the racial superiority of English-speaking nations so that they could satisfy their hunger for world domination, and that such a declaration was a call for war on the USSR. The Soviet leader also dismissed the accusation that the USSR was exerting increasing control over the countries lying in its sphere. He argued that there was nothing surprising in the fact that the Soviet Union, anxious for its future safety, was trying to see to it that governments loyal in their attitude to the Soviet Union should exist in these countries. Soviet territorial demands to Turkey regarding the Dardanelles and the Turkish Straits crisis and Black Sea border disputes were also a major factor in increasing tensions. In September, the Soviet side produced the Novikov telegram, sent by the Soviet ambassador to the U.S., but commissioned and co-authored by Vyacheslav Molotov. It portrayed the U.S. as being in the grip of monopoly capitalists who were building up military capability to prepare the conditions for winning world supremacy in a new world supremacy in a new war. On 6 September 1946, James F. Burns delivered a speech in Germany repudiating the Morgenthau Plan, a proposal to partition and deindustrialize post-war Germany and warning the Soviets that the U.S. intended to maintain a military presence in Europe indefinitely. As Barnes stated a month later, the nub of our program was to win the German people. It was a battle between us and Russia over mines. In December, the Soviets agreed to withdraw from Iran after persistent U.S. pressure, an early success of containment policy. By 1947, U.S. President Harry S. Truman was outraged by the perceived resistance of the Soviet Union to American demands in Iran, Turkey, and Greece, as well as Soviet rejection of the Baruch Plan on nuclear weapons. In February 1947, the British government announced that it could no longer afford to finance the Kingdom of Greece in its civil war against communist-led insurgents. In the same month, Stalin conducted the rigged 1947 Polish legislative election, which constituted an open breach of the Yalta Agreement. The U.S. government responded to this announcement by adopting a policy of containment with the goal of stopping the spread of communism. Truman delivered a speech calling for the allocation of $400 million to intervene in the war and unveiled the Truman Doctrine, which framed the conflict as a contest between free peoples and totalitarian regimes. American policymakers accused the Soviet Union of conspiring against the Greek royalists in an effort to expand Soviet influence, even though Stalin had told the Communist Party to cooperate with the British-backed government. The insurgents were helped by Josip Broz Tito's Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia against Stalin's wishes. Enunciation of the Truman Doctrine marked the beginning of a U.S. bipartisan defense and foreign policy consensus between Republicans and Democrats focused on containment and deterrence. That weakened during and after the Vietnam War, but ultimately persisted thereafter. Moderate and conservative parties in Europe, as well as social democrats, gave virtually unconditional support to the Western Alliance, while European and American communists, financed by the KGB and involved in its intelligence operations, adhered to Moscow's line, although dissent began to appear after 1956. Other critiques of the consensus policy came from anti-Vietnam War activists, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and the anti-nuclear movement. In early 1947, France, Britain, and the United States unsuccessfully attempted to reach an agreement with the Soviet Union for a plan envisioning an economically self-sufficient Germany, including a detailed accounting of the industrial plants, goods, and infrastructure already taken by the Soviets. In June 1947, in accordance with the Truman Doctrine, the United States enacted the Marshall Plan, a pledge of economic assistance for all European countries willing to participate, including the Soviet Union. Under the plan, which President Harry S. Truman signed on 3 April 1948, the U.S. government gave to Western European countries over $13 billion, equivalent to $189.39 billion in 2016, to rebuild the economy of Europe. Later, the program led to the creation of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. The plan's aim was to rebuild the democratic and economic systems of Europe and to counter perceived threats to Europe's balance of power, such as communist parties seizing control through revolutions or elections. The plan also stated that European prosperity was contingent upon German economic recovery. 1 month later, Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947, creating a unified Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency (CCI), and the National Security Council (ENSC). These would become the main bureaucracies for U.S. defense policy in the Cold War. Stalin believed that economic integration with the West would allow Eastern Bloc countries to escape Soviet control, and that the U.S. was trying to buy a pro-U.S. realignment of Europe. Stalin therefore prevented Eastern Bloc nations from receiving Marshall Plan aid. The Soviet Union's alternative to the Marshall Plan, which was purported to involve Soviet subsidies and trade with Central and Eastern Europe, became known as the Molotov Plan, later institutionalized in January 1949 as the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Stalin was also fearful of a reconstituted Germany. His vision of a post-war Germany did not include the ability to rearm or pose any kind of threat to the Soviet Union. In early 1948, following reports of strengthening reactionary elements, Soviet operatives executed a coup d'état in Czechoslovakia, resulting in the formation of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, 9 May 1948, the only Eastern Bloc state that the Soviets had permitted to retain democratic structures. The public brutality of the coup shocked Western powers more than any event up to that point, set in motion a brief scare that war would occur, and swept away the last vestiges of opposition to the Marshall Plan in the United States Congress in an immediate aftermath of the crisis. The London 6 Power Conference was held, resulting in the Soviet boycott of the Allied Control Council and its incapacitation, an event marking the beginning of the full-blown Cold War and the end of its prelude, as well as ending any hopes at the time for a single German government and leading to formation in 1949 of the Federal Republic of Germany and German Democratic Republic. The twin policies of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan led to billions in economic and military aid for Western Europe, Greece, and Turkey. With the U.S. assistance, the Greek military won its civil war. Under the leadership of Alcide de Gasperi, the Italian Christian Democrats defeated the powerful Communist Socialist Alliance in the elections of 1948. All major powers engaged in espionage using a great variety of spies, double agents, moles, and new technologies such as the tapping of telephone cables. The Soviet KGB Committee for State Security, the bureau responsible for foreign espionage and internal surveillance, was famous for its effectiveness. The most famous Soviet operation involved its atomic spies that delivered crucial information from the United States Manhattan Project, leading the USSR to detonate its first nuclear weapon in 1949, 4 years after the American detonation and much sooner than expected. A massive network of informants throughout the Soviet Union was used to monitor dissent from official Soviet politics and morals. Although to an extent disinformation had always existed, the term itself was invented and the strategy formalized by a black propaganda department of the Soviet KGB, based on the amount of top-secret Cold War archival information that has been released. Historian Raymond L. Garthoff concludes there probably was parity in the quantity and quality of secret information obtained by each side. However, the Soviets probably had an advantage in terms of human intelligence or interpersonal espionage, and sometimes in its reach into high policy circles. In terms of decisive impact, however, he concludes, we also can now have high confidence in the judgment that there were no successful moles at the political decision-making level on either side. Similarly, there is no evidence on either side of any major political or military decision that was prematurely discovered through espionage and thwarted by the other side. There also is no evidence of any major political or military decision that was crucially influenced, much less generated, by an agent of the other side. According to historian Robert Louis Benson, Washington's forte was signals intelligence, the procurement and analysis of coded foreign messages, leading to the Venona Project or Venona Intercepts, which monitored the communications of Soviet intelligence agents. Moynihan wrote that the Venona Project contained overwhelming proof of the activities of Soviet spy networks in America, complete with names, dates, places, and deeds. The Venona Project was kept highly secret, even from policymakers, until the Moynihan Commission in 1995. Despite this, the decryption project had already been betrayed and dispatched to the USS by Kim Philby and Bill Wiseman in 1946, as was discovered by the US by 1950. Nonetheless, the Soviets had to keep their discovery of the program secret, too, and continued leaking their own information, some of which was still useful to the American program. According to Moynihan, even President Truman may not have been fully informed of Venona, which may have left him unaware of the extent of Soviet espionage. Clandestine atomic spies from the Soviet Union who infiltrated the Manhattan Project at various points during World War I played a major role in increasing tensions that led to the Cold War. In addition to usual espionage, the Western agencies paid special attention to debriefing Eastern Bloc defectors. Edward J. Epstein describes that the ECI understood that the KGB used provocations or fake defections as a trick to embarrass Western intelligence and establish Soviet double agents. As a result, from 1959 to 1973, the ACIA required that East Bloc defectors went through a counterintelligence investigation before being recruited as a source of intelligence during the late 1970s and 1980s. the KGB perfected its use of espionage to sway and distort diplomacy. Active measures were clandestine operations designed to further Soviet foreign policy goals, consisting of disinformation, forgeries, leaks to foreign media, and the channeling of aid to militant groups. Retired KGB Major General Oleg Kalugin, former head of foreign counterintelligence for the KGB, 1973-1979, described active measures as the heart and soul of Soviet intelligence. Described active measures as the heart between the U.S. also occurred between the USS and PUKE. In September 1947, the Soviets created Cominform to impose orthodoxy within the international communist movement and tighten political control over Soviet satellites through coordination of communist parties in the Eastern Bloc. Cominform faced an embarrassing setback the following June, when the Tito-Stalin split obliged its members to expel Yugoslavia, which remained communist but adopted a non-aligned position and began accepting financial aid from the United States. Besides Berlin, the status of the city of Trieste was at issue. Until the break between Tito and Stalin, the Western powers and the Eastern Bloc faced each other uncompromisingly. In addition to capitalism and communism, Italians and Slovenese monarchists and republicans, as well as war winners and losers of 10, faced each other irreconcilably. The neutral buffer state-free territory of Trieste, founded in 1947 with the United Nations, was split up and dissolved in 1954 and 1975, also because of the detente between the West and Tito. The United States and Britain merged their Western German occupation zones into Bizonia, 1 January 1947, later Trizonia, with the addition of France's zone, April 1949. As part of the economic rebuilding of Germany in early 1948, representatives of a number of Western European governments and the United States announced an agreement for a merger of Western German areas into a federal governmental system. In addition, in accordance with the Marshall Plan, they began to reindustrialize and rebuild the West German economy, including the introduction of a new Duchy mark currency to replace the old Reichsmark currency that the Soviets had debased. The U.S. had secretly decided that a unified and neutral Germany was undesirable, with Walter Bedell Smith telling General Eisenhower, in spite of our announced position, "We really do not want nor intend to accept German unification on any terms that the Russians might agree to, even though they seem to meet most of our requirements." Shortly thereafter, Stalin instituted the Berlin Blockade, 24 June 1948. 12 May 1949, one of the first major crises of the Cold War, preventing Western food, materials, and supplies from arriving in the West Germany's exclave of West Berlin. The United States, primarily Britain, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several other countries began the massive Berlin Airlift, supplying West Berlin with food and other provisions despite Soviet threats. The Soviets mounted a public relations campaign against the policy change. Once again, the East Berlin communists attempted to disrupt the Berlin municipal elections, as they had done in the 1946 elections, which were held on 5 December 1948, and produced a turnout of 86.3% and an overwhelming victory for the non-communist parties. The results effectively divided the city into East and West, the latter comprising U.S., British, and French sectors. 300,000 Berliners demonstrated and urged the international airlift to continue, and U.S. Air Force pilot Gail Halvorsen created Operation Vettles, which supplied candy to German children. The airlift was as much a logistical as a political and psychological success for the West. It firmly linked West Berlin to the United States. In May 1949, Stalin backed down and lifted the blockade. In 1952, Stalin repeatedly proposed a plan to unify East and West Germany under a single government chosen in elections supervised by the United Nations if the new Germany were to stay out of Western military alliances. But this proposal was turned down by the Western powers. Some sources dispute the sincerity of the proposal. Britain, France, the United States, Canada, and 8 other Western European countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty of April 1949, establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. That August, the first Soviet atomic device was detonated in Semipalatinsk, Kazakh SSR. Following Soviet refusals to participate in a German rebuilding effort set forth by Western European countries in 1948, the US, Britain, and France spearheaded the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany from the three Western zones of occupation in April 1949. The Soviet Union proclaimed its zone of occupation in Germany, the German Democratic Republic, that October. Media in the Eastern Bloc was an organ of the state, completely reliant on and subservient to the Communist Party. Radio and television organizations were state-owned, while print media was usually owned by political organizations, mostly by the local Communist Party. Soviet radio broadcasts used Marxist rhetoric to attack capitalism, emphasizing themes of labor exploitation, imperialism, and warmongering, along with the broadcasts of the British Broadcasting Corporation (BBC) and the Voice of America to Central and Eastern Europe. A major propaganda effort begun in 1949 was Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, dedicated to bringing about the peaceful demise of the communist system in the Eastern Bloc. Radio Free Europe attempted to achieve these goals by serving as a surrogate home radio station, an alternative to the controlled and party-dominated domestic press in the Soviet bloc. Radio Free Europe was a product of some of the most prominent architects of America's early Cold War strategy, especially those who believed that the Cold War would eventually be fought by political rather than military means, such as George F. Kennan. Soviet and Eastern Bloc authorities used various methods to suppress Western broadcasts, including radio jamming. American policymakers, including Kennan and John Foster Dulles, acknowledged that the Cold War was in its essence a war of ideas. The United States, acting through the CIA, funded a long list of projects to counter the communist appeal among intellectuals in Europe and the developing world. The CIA also covertly sponsored a domestic propaganda campaign called Crusade for Freedom. The rearmament of West Germany was achieved in the early 1950s. Its main promoter was Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany, with France the main opponent. Washington had the decisive voice. It was strongly supported by the Pentagon, the U.S. military leadership, and weakly opposed by President Truman. The State Department was ambivalent. The outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 changed the calculations, and Washington now gave full support. That also involved naming Dwight D. Eisenhower in charge of NATO forces and sending more American troops to West Germany. There was a strong promise that West Germany would not develop nuclear weapons. Widespread fears of another rise of German militarism necessitated the new military to operate within an alliance framework under NATO command. In 1955, Washington secured full German membership of NATO. In May 1953, Lavrenti Beria, by then in a government post, had made an unsuccessful proposal to allow the reunification of a neutral Germany to prevent West Germany's incorporation into NATO, but his attempts were cut short after he was executed several months later during a Soviet power struggle. The events led to the establishment of the Bundeswehr, the West German military, in 1955. In 1949, Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army defeated Chiang Kai-shek's United States, backed Kuomintang K nationalist government in China, the KMT nationalist government in China. The KMT controlled territory was now restricted to the island of Taiwan, the nationalist government of which exists. The Kremlin promptly created an alliance with the newly formed People's Republic of China. According to Norwegian historian Odd Arne Wested, the communists won the Civil War because they made fewer military mistakes than Chiang Kai-shek made, and because in his search for a powerful centralized government, Chiang antagonized too many interest groups in China. Moreover, his party was weakened during the war against Japan. Meanwhile, the communists told different groups, such as the peasants, exactly what they wanted to hear, and they cloaked themselves under the cover of Chinese nationalism. Confronted with the communist revolution in China and the end of the American atomic monopoly in 1949, the Truman administration quickly moved to escalate and expand its containment doctrine. In NSC 68, a secret 1950 document, the National Security Council proposed reinforcing pro-Western alliance systems and quadrupling spending on defense. Truman, under the influence of advisor Paul Nietzsche, saw containment as implying complete rollback of Soviet influence in all its forms. United States officials moved to expand this version of containment into Asia, Africa, and Latin America in order to counter revolutionary nationalist movements, often led by communist parties financed by the USSR. In this way, this U.S. would exercise preponderant power, oppose neutrality, and establish global hegemony. In the early 1950s, a period sometimes known as the Pactomania, the U.S. formalized a series of alliances with Japan, a former WWII enemy, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand and the Philippines, New Zealand, Thailand and the Philippines not ably annexed us in 1954, thereby guaranteeing the United States' number of long-term military bases. One of the more significant examples of the implementation of containment was the United Nations U.S.-led intervention in the Korean War. In June 1950, after years of mutual hostilities, Kim Il-sung's North Korean People's Army invaded South Korea at the 38th parallel. Stalin had been reluctant to support the invasion but ultimately sent advisors. To Stalin's surprise, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 82 and 83 backed the defense of South Korea, although the Soviets were then boycotting meetings in protest of the fact that Taiwan Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China, held a permanent seat on the council. A UN force of 16 countries faced North Korea, although 40% of troops were South Korean and about 50% were from the United States. The U.S. initially seemed to follow containment when it first entered the war. This directed the U.S.'s action to only push back North Korea across the 38th parallel and restore South Korea's sovereignty while allowing North Korea's survival as a state. However, the success of the Incheon landing inspired the U.S. UN forces to pursue a rollback strategy instead, and to overthrow communist North Korea, thereby allowing nationwide elections under UN auspices. General Douglas MacArthur then advanced across the 38th parallel into North Korea. The Chinese, fearful of a possible U.S. invasion, sent in a large army and defeated the UN forces, pushing them back below the 38th parallel. Truman publicly hinted that he might use his ace in the hole of the atomic bomb, but Mao was unmoved. The episode was used to support the wisdom of the containment doctrine as opposed to rollback. The communists were later pushed to roughly around the original border, with minimal changes. Among other effects, the Korean War galvanized NATO to develop a military structure. Public opinion in countries involved, such as Great Britain, was divided for and against the war. After the armistice was approved in July 1953, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung created a highly centralized totalitarian dictatorship that accorded his family unlimited power while generating a pervasive cult of personality. In the South, the American-backed dictator Syngman Rhee ran a violently anti-communist and authoritarian regime. While Rhee was overthrown in 1960, South Korea continued to be ruled by a military government of former Japanese collaborators until the re-establishment of a multi-party system in the late 1980s. Subsequently, South Korea experienced an economic boom and became one of the most advanced countries on the planet. In 1953, changes in political leadership on both sides shifted the dynamic of the Cold War. Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated president that January. During the last 18 months of the Truman administration, the American defense budget had quadrupled, and Eisenhower moved to reduce military spending by a third while continuing to fight the Cold War effectively. Joseph Stalin died in 1953. Without a mutually agreeable successor, the highest Communist Party officials initially opted to rule the Soviet Union jointly through a troika headed by Georgy Malenkov. This did not last, however, and Nikita Khrushchev eventually won the ensuing power struggle by the mid-1950s. In 1956, he denounced Joseph Stalin and proceeded to ease controls over the party and society. This was known as de-Stalinization. On 18 November 1956, while addressing Western dignitaries at a reception in Moscow's Polish embassy. Khrushchev infamously declared, "Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you," shocking everyone present. He would later claim he had not been referring to nuclear war, but the historically fated victory of communism over capitalism. In 1961, Khrushchev boasted that, even if the Soviet Union was currently behind the West, its housing shortage would disappear within 10 years, consumer goods would be made abundant, and the construction of a communist society would be completed in the main within no more than 2 decades. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, initiated a new look for the containment strategy, calling for a greater reliance on nuclear weapons against U.S. enemies in wartime. Dulles also enunciated the doctrine of massive retaliation, threatening a severe U.S. response to any Soviet aggression. Possessing nuclear superiority, for example, allowed Eisenhower to face down Soviet threats to intervene in the Middle East during the 1956 Suez Crisis. The declassified U.S. plans for retaliatory nuclear strikes in the late 1950s included the systematic destruction of 1,200 major urban centers in the Soviet bloc and China, including Moscow, East Berlin, and Beijing. In spite of these events, there were substantial hopes for detente when an upswing in diplomacy took place in 1959, including a 2-week visit by Khrushchev to the U.S., and plans for a two-power summit for May 1960. The latter was disturbed by the U-2 spy plane scandal, however, in which Eisenhower was caught lying about the intrusion of American surveillance aircraft into Soviet territory. While Stalin's death in 1953 slightly relaxed tensions, the situation in Europe remained an uneasy armed truce. The Soviets, who had already created a network of mutual assistance treaties in the Eastern Bloc by 1949, established a formal alliance therein, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955. It stood opposed to NATO. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 occurred shortly after Khrushchev arranged the removal of Hungary's Stalinist leader Matyas Sarkozy. In response to a popular anti-communist uprising, the new regime formally disbanded the secret police, declared its intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, and pledged to re-establish free elections. The Soviet army invaded. Thousands of Hungarians were killed and arrested, imprisoned and deported to the Soviet Union, and approximately 200,000 Hungarians fled Hungary in the chaos. Hungarian leader Imre Nagy and others were executed following secret trials. From 1957 through 1961, Khrushchev openly and repeatedly threatened the West with nuclear annihilation. He claimed that Soviet missile capabilities were far superior to those of the United States, capable of wiping out any American or European city. According to John Lewis Gaddis, Khrushchev rejected Stalin's belief in the inevitability of war, however. The new leader declared his ultimate goal was peaceful coexistence. In Khrushchev's formulation, peace would allow capitalism to collapse on its own, as well as giving the Soviets time to boost their military capabilities, which remained for decades until Gorbachev's later new thinking. Envisioning peaceful coexistence as an end in itself, rather than a form of class struggle. The events in Hungary produced ideological fractures within the communist parties of the world, particularly in Western Europe, with great decline in membership, as many in both Western and socialist countries felt disillusioned by the brutal Soviet response. The communist parties in the West would never recover from the effect the Hungarian Revolution had on their membership, a fact that was immediately recognized by some, such as the Yugoslavian politician Milovan Dilas, who shortly after the revolution was crushed, said that the wound which the Hungarian Revolution inflicted on communism can never be completely healed. In 1957, Polish Foreign Minister Adam Rapacki proposed the Rapacki Plan for a nuclear-free zone in Central Europe. Public opinion tended to be favorable in the West, but it was rejected by leaders of West Germany, Britain, France, and the United States. They feared it would leave the powerful conventional armies of the Warsaw Pact dominant over the weaker NATO armies. During November 1958, Khrushchev made an unsuccessful attempt to turn all of Berlin into an independent, demilitarized free city. He gave the United States, Great Britain, and France a 6-month ultimatum to withdraw their troops from the sectors of West Berlin, or he would transfer control of Western access rights to the East Germans. Khrushchev earlier explained to Mao Zedong that Berlin is the testicles of the West. Every time I want to make the West scream, I squeeze on Berlin. And NATO formally rejected the ultimatum in mid-December, and Khrushchev withdrew it in return for a Geneva conference on the German question. John F. Kennedy's foreign policy was dominated by American confrontations with the Soviet Union, manifested by proxy contests. Like Truman and Eisenhower, Kennedy supported containment to stop the spread of communism. President Eisenhower's New Look policy had emphasized the use of less expensive nuclear weapons to deter Soviet aggression by threatening massive nuclear attacks on all of the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons were much cheaper than maintaining a large standing army, so Eisenhower cut conventional forces to save money. Kennedy implemented a new strategy known as flexible response. This strategy relied on conventional arms to achieve limited goals. As part of this policy, Kennedy expanded the United States Special Operations Forces, elite military units that could fight unconventionally in various conflicts. Kennedy hoped that the flexible response strategy would allow the U.S. to counter Soviet influence without resorting to nuclear war. To support his new strategy, Kennedy ordered a massive increase in defense spending. He sought, and Congress provided, a rapid buildup of the nuclear arsenal to restore the lost superiority over the Soviet Union. He claimed in 1960 that Eisenhower had lost it because of excessive concern with budget deficit. In his inaugural address, Kennedy promised to bear any burden in the defense of liberty, and he repeatedly asked for increases in military spending and authorization of new weapons systems. From 1961 to 1964, the number of nuclear weapons increased by 50%, as did the number of B-52 bombers to deliver them. The new ICBM force grew from 63 intercontinental ballistic missiles to 424. He authorized 23 new Polaris submarines, each of which carried 16 nuclear missiles. Kennedy also called on cities to construct fallout shelters. Nationalist movements in some countries and regions, notably Guatemala, Indonesia, and Indochina, were often allied with communist groups or otherwise perceived to be unfriendly to Western interests. In this context, the United States and the Soviet Union increasingly competed for influence by proxy in the Third World as decolonization gained momentum in the 1950s and early 1960s. Both sides were selling armaments to gain influence. The Kremlin saw continuing territorial losses by imperial powers as presaging the eventual victory of their ideology. The United States used the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, to undermine neutral or hostile Third World governments and to support allied ones. In 1953, President Eisenhower implemented Operation Ajax, a covert coup operation to overthrow the Iranian Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. The popularly elected Mossadegh had been a Middle Eastern nemesis of Britain since nationalizing the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951. Winston Churchill told the United States that Mossadegh was increasingly turning towards communist influence. The pro-Western Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, assumed control as an autocratic monarch. The Shah's policies included banning the Communist Tud Party of Iran and general suppression of political dissent by ISAV, aka the Shah's domestic security and intelligence agency. In Guatemala, a banana republic, the 1954 Guatemalan coup ousted the left-wing President Jacobo Arbenz with material CIA support. The post-Arbenz government, a military junta headed by Carlos Castillo Armas, repealed a progressive land reform law, returned nationalized property belonging to the United Fruit Company, set up a National Committee of Defense Against Communism, and decreed a preventive penal law against communism. At the request of the United States, the non-aligned Indonesian government of Sukarno was faced with a major threat to its legitimacy, beginning in 1956 when several regional commanders began to demand autonomy from Jakarta. After mediation failed, Sukarno took action to remove the dissident commanders. In February 1958, dissident military commanders in Central Sumatra, Colonel Ahmad Hussein, and North Sulawesi, Colonel Vence Sumual, declared the Revolutionary Government of the Republic of Indonesia, Permesta movement aimed at overthrowing the Sukarno regime. They were joined by many civilian politicians from the Masyumi party, such as Jafruddin Praweranegara, who were opposed to the growing influence of the Communist Partai Komunis Indonesia. Due to their anti-communist rhetoric, the rebels received arms, funding, and other covert aid from the SCIA, until Alan Lawrence Pope, an American pilot, was shot down after a bombing raid on government, held Ambon in April 1958. The central government responded by launching airborne and seaborne military invasions of rebel strongholds at Padang and Manado. By the end of 1958, the rebels were militarily defeated, and the last remaining rebel guerrilla bands surrendered by August 1961. In the Republic of the Congo, newly independent from Belgium since June 1960, the Congo crisis erupted on 5 July, leading to the secession of the regions Katanga and South Kasai. CIA. Backed President Joseph Kasa Vubu ordered the dismissal of the democratically elected Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and the Lumumba cabinet in September over massacres by the armed forces during the invasion of South Kasai and for involving Soviets in the country. Later, the SCIA. Backed Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko quickly mobilized his forces to seize power through a military coup d'état and worked with Western intelligence agencies to imprison Lumumba and hand him over to Katangan authorities, who executed him by firing squad. In British Guiana, the leftist People's Progressive Party (PPP) candidate Chetty Jagan won the position of chief minister in a colonially administered election in 1953, but was quickly forced to resign from power after Britain's suspension of the still dependent nation's constitution. Embarrassed by the landslide electoral victory of Jagan's allegedly Marxist party, the British imprisoned the PPIS leadership and maneuvered the organization into a divisive rupture in 1955, engineering a split between Jagan and his PPP colleagues. Jagan again won the colonial elections in 1957 and 1961, despite Britain's shift to a reconsideration of its view of the left-wing Jagan as a Soviet-style communist at this time. The United States pressured the British to withhold Guyana's independence until an alternative to Jagan could be identified, supported, and brought into office, worn down by the Communist guerrilla war for Vietnamese independence, and handed a watershed defeat by Communist Viet Minh rebels at the 1954 Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French accepted a negotiated abandonment of their colonial stake in Vietnam. In the Geneva Conference, peace accords were signed, leaving Vietnam divided between a pro-Soviet administration in North Vietnam and a pro-Western administration in South Vietnam at the 17th parallel north. Between 1954 and 1961, Eisenhower's United States sent economic aid and military advisors to strengthen South Vietnam's pro-Western government against communist efforts to destabilize it. Many emerging nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America rejected the pressure to choose sides in the East-West competition. In 1955, at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, dozens of Third World governments resolved to stay out of the Cold War. The consensus reached at Bandung culminated with the creation of the Belgrade, headquartered non-aligned movement in 1961. Meanwhile, Khrushchev broadened Moscow's policy to establish ties with India and other key neutral states. Independence movements in the Third World transformed the post-war order into a more pluralistic world of decolonized African and Middle Eastern nations and of rising nationalism in Asia and Latin America. After 1956, the Sino-Soviet alliance began to break down. Mao had defended Stalin when Khrushchev criticized him in 1956 and treated the new Soviet leader as a superficial upstart, accusing him of having lost his revolutionary edge. For his part, Khrushchev, disturbed by Mao's glib attitude toward nuclear war, referred to the Chinese leader as a lunatic on a throne. After this, Khrushchev made many desperate attempts to reconstitute the Sino-Soviet alliance, but Mao considered it useless and denied any proposal. The Chinese-Soviet animosity spilled out in an intra-communist propaganda war. Further on, the Soviets focused on a bitter rivalry with Mao's China for leadership of the global communist movement. Historian Lorenz M. Luthi argues, the Sino-Soviet split was one of the key events of the Cold War, equal in importance to the construction of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Second Vietnam War, and Sino-American rearmament. The split helped to determine the framework of the Second Cold War in general, and influenced the course of the Second Vietnam War in particular. On the nuclear weapons front, the United States and the Soviet Union pursued nuclear rearmament and developed long-range weapons with which they could strike the territory of the other. In August 1957, the Soviets successfully launched the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, and in October they launched the first Earth satellite, Sputnik 1. The launch of Sputnik inaugurated the space race. This led to the Apollo moon landings by the United States, which astronaut Frank Borman later described as just a battle in the Cold War. The public's reaction in the Soviet Union was mixed. The Soviet government limited the release of information about the lunar landing, which affected the reaction. A portion of the populace did not give it any attention, and another portion was angered by it. A major Cold War element of the space race was satellite reconnaissance, as well as signals intelligence to gauge which aspects of the space programs had military capabilities. Later, however, the U.S. and USSR pursued some cooperation in space as part of detente, such as Apollo-Soyuz. In Cuba, the 26th of July movement, led by young revolutionaries Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, seized power in the Cuban Revolution on 1 January 1959, toppling President Fulgencio Batista, whose unpopular regime had been denied arms by the Eisenhower administration. Although Fidel Castro's first refused to categorize his new government as socialist and repeatedly denying being a communist, Castro appointed Marxists to senior government and military positions. Most significantly, Che Guevara became governor of the central bank and then minister of industries. Diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States continued for some time after Batista's fall, but President Eisenhower deliberately left the capital to avoid meeting Castro during the latter's trip to Washington, D.C. in April, leaving Vice President Richard Nixon to conduct the meeting in his place. Cuba began negotiating for arms purchases from the Eastern Bloc in March 1960. The same month, Eisenhower gave approval to CIA plans and funding to overthrow Castro. In January 1961, just prior to leaving office, Eisenhower formally severed relations with the Cuban government. That April, the administration of newly elected American President John F. Kennedy mounted the unsuccessful CIA organized ship-borne invasion of the island by Cuban exiles at Playa Girón and Playa Larga in Santa Clara province, a failure that publicly humiliated the United States. Castro responded by publicly embracing Marxism, Leninism, and the Soviet Union pledged to provide further support. In December, the U.S. government began a campaign of terrorist attacks against Cuba and covert operations and sabotage against the administration in an attempt to overthrow the Castro regime. The Berlin Crisis of 1961 was the last major incident in the Cold War regarding the status of Berlin in post-World War II Germany. By the early 1950s, the Soviet approach to restricting emigration movement was emulated by most of the rest of the Eastern Bloc. However, hundreds of thousands of East Germans annually emigrated to free and prosperous West Germany through a loophole in the system that existed between East Berlin and West Berlin. The immigration resulted in a massive brain drain from East Germany to West Germany of younger educated professionals, such that nearly 20% of East Germany's population had migrated to West Germany by 1961. That June, the Soviet Union issued a new ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of Allied forces from West Berlin. The request was rebuffed, but the United States now limited its security guarantees to West Berlin. On 13 August, East Germany erected a barbed wire barrier that would eventually be expanded through construction into the Berlin Wall, effectively closing the loophole and preventing its citizens from fleeing to the west. The Kennedy administration continued seeking ways to oust Castro following the Bay of Pigs invasion, experimenting with various ways of covertly facilitating the overthrow of the Cuban government. Significant hopes were pinned on the program of terrorist attacks and other destabilization operations known as Operation Mongoose that was devised under the Kennedy administration in 1961. Khrushchev learned of the project in February 1962, and preparations to install Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba were undertaken in response. Alarmed, Kennedy considered various reactions. He ultimately responded to the installation of nuclear missiles in Cuba with a naval blockade, and he presented an ultimatum to the Soviets. Khrushchev backed down from a confrontation, and the Soviet Union removed the missiles in return for a public American pledge not to invade Cuba again, as well as a covert deal to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Castro later admitted that I would have agreed to the use of nuclear weapons. We took it for granted that it would become a nuclear war anyway, and that we were going to disappear. The Cuban Missile Crisis, November 1962, brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. The aftermath of the crisis led to the first efforts in the nuclear arms race at nuclear disarmament and improving relations. Although the Cold War's first arms control agreement, the Antarctic Treaty, had come into force in 1961, the compromise embarrassed Khrushchev and the Soviet Union because the withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Italy and Turkey was a secret deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the Soviets were seen as retreating from circumstances that they had started. In 1964, Khrushchev's Kremlin colleagues managed to oust him, but allowed him a peaceful retirement. He was accused of rudeness and incompetence, and John Lewis Gaddis argues that he was also blamed with ruining Soviet agriculture, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war, and becoming an international embarrassment when he authorized construction of the Berlin Wall. According to Dobrynin, the top Soviet leadership took the Cuban outcome as a blow to its prestige bordering on humiliation. In the course of the 1960s and 1970s, Cold War participants struggled to adjust to a new, more complicated pattern of international relations in which the world was no longer divided into two clearly opposed blocs. From the beginning of the post-war period, with American help, Western Europe and Japan rapidly recovered from the destruction of World War II and sustained strong economic growth through the 1950s and 1960s, with per capita GDPs approaching those of the United States, while Eastern Bloc economies stagnated. The Vietnam War descended into a quagmire for the United States, leading to a decline in international prestige and economic stability, derailing arms agreements and provoking domestic unrest. America's withdrawal from the war led it to embrace a policy of detente with both China and the Soviet Union. In the 1973 oil crisis, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEP, cut their petroleum output. This raised oil prices and hurt Western economies, but helped the Soviet Union by generating a huge flow of money from its oil sales. As a result of the oil crisis, combined with the growing influence of Third World alignments such as OPEC and the non-aligned movement, less powerful countries had more room to assert their independence and often showed themselves resistant to pressure from either superpower. Meanwhile, Moscow was forced to turn its attention inward to deal with the Soviet Union's deep-seated domestic economic problems. During this period, Soviet leaders such as Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin embraced the notion of detente. Under President John F. Kennedy, U.S. troop levels in Vietnam grew under the Military Assistance Advisory Group program from just under 1,000 in 1959 to 16,000 in 1963. South Vietnamese President Ngo Dim's heavy-handed crackdown on Buddhist monks in 1963 led the U.S. to endorse a deadly military coup against Diem. The war escalated further in 1964 following the controversial Gulf of Tonkin incident in which a U.S. destroyer was alleged to have clashed with North Vietnamese fast attack craft. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authorization to increase U.S. military presence, deploying ground combat units for the first time and increasing troop levels to 184,000. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev responded by reversing Khrushchev's policy of disengagement and increasing aid to the North Vietnamese, hoping to entice the North from its pro-Chinese position. The USSR discouraged further escalation of the war, however, providing just enough military assistance to tie up American forces. From this point, the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, also known as the North Vietnamese Army, NVAA, engaged in more conventional warfare with U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. The Tet Offensive of 1968 proved to be the turning point of the war. Despite years of American tutelage and aid, the South Vietnamese forces were unable to withstand the communist offensive, and the task fell to us forces instead. That showed that the end of U.S. involvement was not in sight, increasing domestic skepticism of the war and giving rise to what was referred to as the Vietnam Syndrome, a public aversion to American overseas military involvements. Nonetheless, operations continued to cross international boundaries. Bordering areas of Laos and Cambodia were used by North Vietnam as supply routes and were heavily bombed by U.S. forces at the same time in 1963, 1963, 1965. American domestic politics saw the triumph of liberalism. According to historian Joseph Crespino, it has become a staple of 20th century historiography that Cold War concerns were at the root of a number of progressive political accomplishments in the post-war period, a high progressive marginal tax rate that helped fund the arms race and contributed to broad income equality. Bipartisan support for far-reaching civil rights legislation that transformed politics and society in the American South, which had long given the lie to America's egalitarian ethos. Bipartisan support for overturning an explicitly racist immigration system that had been in place since the 1920s, and free healthcare for the elderly and the poor, a partial fulfillment of one of the unaccomplished goals of the New Deal era. The list could go on. The unity of NATO was breached early in its history, with a crisis occurring during Charles de Gaulle's presidency of France. De Gaulle protested at the strong role of the United States in the organization and what he perceived as a special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. In a memorandum sent to President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan on 17 September 1958, he argued for the creation of a tripartite directorate that would put France on an equal footing with the United States and the United Kingdom, and also for the expansion of NATO's coverage to include geographical areas of interest to France, most notably French Algeria, where France was waging a counterinsurgency and sought NATO assistance. De Gaulle considered the response he received to be unsatisfactory and began the development of an independent French nuclear deterrent. In 1966, he withdrew France from NATO's military structures and expelled NATO troops from French soil. Officially claiming to be neutral, Finland lay in the gray zone between the Western countries and the Soviet Union. The IYA Treaty, Sino-Soviet Pact of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, gave the Soviet Union some leverage in Finnish domestic politics, which was later used as the term Finlandization by the West German press, meaning to become like Finlandization by the West German press, meaning to become like Finland. This meant, among other things, the Soviet adaptation spread to the editors of mass media, sparking strong forms of self-control, self-censorship, which included the banning of anti-Soviet books, and pro-Soviet attitudes. Most of the elite of media and politics shifted their attitudes to match the values that the Soviets were thought to favor and approve. Only after the ascent of Mikhail Gorbachev to Soviet leadership in 1985 did mass media in Finland gradually begin to criticize the Soviet Union more. When the Soviet Union allowed non-communist governments to take power in Eastern Europe, Gorbachev suggested they could look to Finland as an example to follow for West German conservative politicians, especially the Bavarian Prime Minister Franz Josef Strauss. The case of Finlandization served as a warning, for example, about how a great power dictates its much smaller neighbor in its internal affairs, and the neighbor's independence becomes formal. During the Cold War, Finlandization was seen not only in Bavaria but also in Western intelligence services as a threat that completely free states had to be warned about in advance. To combat Finlandization, propaganda books and newspaper articles were published through CIA-funded research institutes and media companies which denigrated Finnish neutrality policy and its pro-Soviet president Urho Kekkonen. This was one factor in making room for the East-West espionage on Finnish soil between the two great powers. However, Finland maintained capitalism unlike most other countries bordering the Soviet Union. Even though being a neighbor to the Soviet Union sometimes resulted in overcautious concern in foreign policy, Finland developed closer cooperation with the other Nordist countries and declared itself even more neutral in superpower politics, although in the later years support for capitalism was even more widespread. In 1968, a period of political liberalization took place in Czechoslovakia called the Prague Spring, an action program of reforms included increasing freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of movement, along with an economic emphasis on consumer goods, the possibility of a multi-party government, limitations on the power of the secret police, and potential withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. In answer to the Prague Spring, on 20 August 1968, the Soviet Army, together with most of their Warsaw Pact allies, invaded Czechoslovakia. The invasion was followed by a wave of immigration, including an estimated 70,000 Sikhs and Slovaks initially fleeing, with the total eventually reaching 300,000. The invasion sparked intense protests from Yugoslavia, Romania, China, and from Western European countries. In September 1968, during a speech at the 5th Congress of the Polish United Workers' Party, 1 month after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Brezhnev outlined the Brezhnev Doctrine, in which he claimed the right to violate the sovereignty of any country attempting to replace Marxism-Leninism with capitalism. During the speech, Brezhnev stated, "When forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of some socialist country towards capitalism, it becomes not only a problem of the country concerned, but a common problem and concern of all socialist countries." The doctrine found its origins in the failures of Marxism-Leninism in states like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, which were facing a declining standard of living contrasting with the prosperity of West Germany and the rest of Western Europe. Under the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, which gained power after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the U.S. took a more hardline stance on Latin America, sometimes called the Mann Doctrine. In 1964, the Brazilian military overthrew the government of President João Goulart with US backing. In late April 1965, the U.S. sent some 22,000 troops to the Dominican Republic in an intervention codenamed Operation Power Pack into the Dominican Civil War between supporters of deposed President Juan Bosch and supporters of deposed President Juan Bosch and supporters of General Elias Wesson, eyeing the threat of the emergence of a Cuban-style revolution in Latin America. The OAS also deployed soldiers to the conflict through the mostly Brazilian Inter-American Peace Force. Hector Garcia Gotti acted as provisional president until conservative former President Joaquin Balaguer won the 1966 presidential election against non-campaigning Juan Bosch. Activists for Bosch's Dominican Revolutionary Party were violently harassed by the Dominican police and armed forces. In Indonesia, the hardline anti-communist General Suharto wrested control of the state from his predecessor Sukarno in an attempt to establish a new order. From 1965 to 1966, with the aid of the United States and other Western governments, the military led the mass killing of more than 500,000 members and sympathizers of the Indonesian Communist Party and other leftist organizations, and detained hundreds of thousands more in prison camps around the country under extremely inhumane conditions. A top-secret CIA report stated that the massacres rank as one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century, along with the Soviet purges of the 1930s, the Nazi mass murders during the Second World War, and the Maoist bloodbath of the early 1950s. These killings served U.S. strategic interests and constitute a major turning point in the Cold War as the balance of power shifted in Southeast Asia, escalating the scale of American intervention in the ongoing conflict between Ngo Dinh Diem's South Vietnamese government and the Communist National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam (NLF). Insurgents opposing it, Johnson deployed some 575,000 troops in Southeast Asia to defeat the NLF and their North Vietnamese allies and the Vietnamese allies and the Vietnamese allies and the Vietnamese War. But his costly policy weakened the U.S. economy and sparked domestic anti-war protests, which led to the U.S. withdrawal by 1972. Without American support, South Vietnam was conquered by North Vietnam in 1975. The U.S. reputation suffered as a result, as most of the world saw the events in Vietnam as the defeat of the world's most powerful superpower at the hands of one of the world's poorest nations. The Middle East remained a source of contention. Egypt, which received the bulk of its arms and economic assistance from the USSR, was a troublesome client, with a reluctant Soviet Union feeling obliged to assist in both the 1967 Six-Day War with advisors and technicians, and the War of Attrition with pilots and aircraft against pro-Western Israel. Despite the beginning of an Egyptian shift from a pro-Soviet to a pro-American orientation in 1972, under Egypt's new leader Anwar Sadat, the Soviets supported Egypt and Syria during the Yom Kippur War the following year, as the United States supported Israel. Although pre-Sadat Egypt had been the largest recipient of Soviet aid in the Middle East, the Soviets were also successful in establishing close relations with communist South Yemen, as well as the nationalist governments of Algeria and Iraq. Iraq signed a 15-year treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union in 1972. According to historian Charles R.H. Tripp, the treaty upset the U.S.-sponsored security system established as part of the Cold War in the Middle East. It appeared that any enemy of the Baghdad regime was a potential ally of the United States. In response, the U.S. covertly financed Kurdish rebels led by Mustafa Barzani during the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War. The Kurds were defeated in 1975, leading to the forcible relocation of hundreds of thousands of Kurdish civilians. Indirect Soviet assistance to the Palestinian side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict included support for Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO) in East Africa. A territorial dispute between Somalia and Ethiopia over the Ogaden region resulted in the Ogaden War. Around June 1977, Somali troops occupied the Ogaden and began advancing inland towards Ethiopian positions in the Afmar Mountains. Both countries were client states of the Soviet Union. Somalia was led by self-proclaimed Marxist military leader Syed Barre, and Ethiopia was controlled by the Derg, a cabal of military generals loyal to the pro-Soviet Mengistu Haile Mariam, who had declared the provisional military government of Socialist Ethiopia in 1975. The Soviets initially attempted to exert a moderating influence on both states, but in November 1977 Barre broke off relations with Moscow and expelled his Soviet military advisors. He then turned to the China and Safari Club, a group of pro-American intelligence agencies, including those of Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, for support and weapons. While declining to take a direct part in hostilities, the Soviet Union did provide the impetus for a successful Ethiopian counteroffensive to expel Somalia from the Ogaden. The counteroffensive was planned at the command level by Soviet advisors attached to the Ethiopian General Staff and bolstered by the delivery of millions of dollars of sophisticated Soviet arms. About 11,000 Cuban troops spearheaded the primary effort, after receiving a hasty training on some of the newly delivered Soviet weapon systems by East German instructors. In Chile, the Socialist Party candidate Salvador Allende won the presidential election of 1970, thereby becoming the first democratically elected Marxist to become president of a country in the Americas. The CIA targeted Allende for removal and operated to undermine his support domestically, which contributed to a period of unrest culminating in General Augusto Pinochet's coup d'etat on 11 September 1973. Pinochet consolidated power as a military dictator. Allende's reforms of the economy were rolled back, and leftist opponents were killed or detained in internment camps under the direction de Inteligencia Nacional de The socialist states, with the exception of China and Romania, broke off relations with Chile. The Pinochet regime would go on to be one of the leading participants in Operation Condor, an international campaign of political assassination and state terrorism organized by right-wing military dictatorships in the southern cone of South America that was covertly supported by the U.S. government. On 24 April 1974, the Carnation Revolution succeeded in ousting Marcelo Caetano and Portugal's right-wing Estado Novo government, sounding the death knell for the Portuguese Empire. Independence was hastily granted to a number of Portuguese colonies, including Angola, where the disintegration of colonial rule was followed by a violent civil war. There were three rival militant factions competing for power in Angola: the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, a National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNE, and the National Liberation Front of Angola, NAL. While all three had socialist leanings, the MPLA was the only party with close ties to the Soviet Union. Its adherence to the concept of a Soviet one-party state alienated it from the FNLA and UN, which began portraying themselves as anti-communist and pro-Western in orientation. When the Soviets began supplying the MPLA with arms, the CIA and China offered substantial covert aid to the FNLA and UNITA, the eventually requested direct military support from Moscow in the form of ground troops, but the Soviets declined, offering to send advisors but no combat personnel. Cuba was more forthcoming and began amassing troops in Angola to assist the MPLA. By November 1975, there were over 1,000 Cuban soldiers in the country. The persistent buildup of Cuban troops and Soviet weapons allowed the MPLA to secure victory and blunt an abortive intervention by Zairian and South African troops, which had deployed in a belated attempt to assist the FNLA and UNITA. During the Vietnam War, North Vietnam used border areas of Cambodia as military bases, which Cambodian head of state Norodom Sihanouk tolerated in an attempt to preserve Cambodia's neutrality. Following Sihanouk's March 1970 deposition by pro-American General Lon Nol, who ordered the North Vietnamese to leave Cambodia, North Vietnam attempted to overrun all of Cambodia following negotiations with Nguyen Chia II, in command of the Cambodian communists dubbed the Khmer Rouge, fighting to overthrow the Cambodian government. Sihanouk fled to China with the establishment of the GRUNK in Beijing. American and South Vietnamese forces responded to these actions with a bombing campaign and a brief ground incursion, which contributed to the violence of the civil war that soon enveloped all of Cambodia. U.S. carpet bombing lasted until 1973, and while it prevented the Khmer Rouge from seizing the capital, it also accelerated the collapse of rural society, increased social polarization, and killed tens of thousands of civilians after taking power and distancing himself from the Vietnamese, pro-China. Khmer Rouge leader Pol Pot killed 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians in the killing fields, roughly a quarter of the Cambodian population, an event commonly labeled the Cambodian Genocide. Martin Shaw described these atrocities as the purest genocide of the Cold War era. Backed by the Kampuchean United Front for National Salvation, an organization of Khmer pro-Soviet communists and Khmer Rouge defectors led by Heng Samrin, Vietnam invaded Cambodia on 22 December 1978. The invasion succeeded in deposing Pol Pot, but the new state would struggle to gain international recognition beyond the Soviet bloc sphere. Despite the previous international outcry at the Pol Pot regime's gross human rights violations, representatives of the Khmer Rouge were allowed to be seated in the UN General Assembly with strong support from China, Western powers, and the member countries of Cambodia would become bogged down in a guerrilla war led from refugee camps located on the border with Thailand. Following the destruction of the Khmer Rouge, the national reconstruction of Cambodia would be severely hampered, and Vietnam would suffer a punitive Chinese attack. Although unable to deter Vietnam from ousting Pol Pot from Cambodia, China demonstrated that its Cold War communist adversary, the Soviet Union, was unable to protect its Vietnamese ally, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger wrote that China succeeded in exposing the limits of Soviet strategic reach and speculated that the desire to compensate for their ineffectuality contributed to the Soviets' decision to intervene in Afghanistan a year later. As a result of the Sino-Soviet split, tensions along the Chinese-Soviet border reached their peak in 1969, and United States President Richard Nixon decided to use the conflict to shift the balance of power towards the West in the Cold War. The Chinese had sought improved relations with the Americans in order to gain an advantage over the Soviets as well. In February 1972, Nixon achieved a stunning rapprochement with China, traveling to Beijing and meeting with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, At this time, the USSR achieved rough nuclear parity with the United States. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War both weakened America's influence in the Third World and cooled relations with Western Europe, although indirect conflict between Cold War powers continued through the late 1960s and early 1970s. Tensions were beginning to ease. Following the ousting of Khrushchev, another period of collective leadership ensued, consisting of Leonid Brezhnev as General Secretary, Alexei Kosygin as Premier, and Nikolai Podgorny as Chairman of the Presidium, lasting until Brezhnev established himself in the early 1970s as the preeminent Soviet leader. Following his visit to China, Nixon met with Soviet leaders, including Brezhnev, in Moscow. These strategic arms limitation talks resulted in two landmark arms control treaties. SEATO, the first comprehensive limitation pact signed by the two superpowers, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which banned the development of systems designed to intercept incoming missiles. These aimed to limit the development of costly anti-ballistic missiles and nuclear missiles. Nixon and Brezhnev proclaimed a new era of peaceful coexistence and established the groundbreaking new policy of détente or cooperation between the two superpowers. Meanwhile, Brezhnev attempted to revive the Soviet economy, which was declining in part because of heavy military expenditures. The Soviet Union's military budget in the 1970s was gigantic, forming 40-60% of the entire federal budget and accounting to 15% of the USSR's GDP, 13% of the UN's EDP, 13%. Between 1972 and 1974, the two sides also agreed to strengthen their economic ties, including agreements for increased trade. As a result of their meetings, détente would replace the hostility of the Cold War, and the two countries would live mutually. These developments coincided with Bond's Ostpolitik policy formulated by the West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, an effort to normalize relations between West Germany and Eastern Europe. Other agreements were concluded to stabilize the situation in Europe, culminating in the Helsinki Accord signed at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1975. The Helsinki Accords, in which the Soviets promised to grant free elections in Europe, has been called a major concession to ensure peace by the Soviets. In practice, the Soviet government significantly curbed the rule of law, civil liberties, protection of law, and guarantees of property, which were considered examples of bourgeois morality by Soviet legal theorists such as Andrei Vyshinsky. The Soviet Union signed legally binding human rights documents such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1973 and the Helsinki Accords in 1975, but they were neither widely known or accessible to people living under communist rule, nor were they taken seriously by the communist authorities. Human rights activists in the Soviet Union were regularly subjected to harassment, repressions, and arrests. The pro-Soviet American business magnate Armand Hammer of Occidental Petroleum often mediated trade relations. Author Daniel Yergin, in his book The Prize, writes that Hammer ended up as a go-between for 5 Soviet general secretaries and 7 U.S. presidents. Hammer had extensive business relationship in the Soviet Union stretching back to the 1920s with Lenin's approval. According to Christian Science Monitor in 1980, although his business dealings with the Soviet Union were cut short when Stalin came to power, he had more or less single-handedly laid the groundwork for the 1980 state of Western trade with the Soviet Union. In 1974, Brezhnev publicly recognized Hammer's role in facilitating East-West trade. By 1981, according to the New York Times in that year, Hammer was on a first-name basis with Leonid Brezhnev. Kissinger and Nixon were realists who de-emphasized idealistic goals like anti-communism or promotion of democracy worldwide because those goals were too expensive in terms of America's economic capabilities. Instead of a Cold War, they wanted peace, trade, and cultural exchanges. They realized that Americans were no longer willing to tax themselves for idealistic foreign policy goals, especially for containment policies that never seemed to produce positive results. Instead, Nixon and Kissinger sought to downsize America's global commitments in proportion to its reduced economic, moral, and political power. They rejected idealism as impractical and too expensive, and neither man showed much sensitivity to the plight of people living under communism. Kissinger's realism fell out of fashion as idealism returned to American foreign policy, with Carter's moralism emphasizing human rights and Reagan's rollback strategy aimed at destroying communism. In the 1970s, the KGB, led by Yuri Andropov, continued to persecute distinguished Soviet dissidents, such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov, who were criticizing the Soviet leadership in harsh terms. Indirect conflict between the superpowers continued through this period of detente in the Third World, particularly during political crises in the Middle East, Chile, Ethiopia, and Angola. In 1973, Nixon announced his administration was committed to seeking most favored nation trade status with the USSR, which was challenged by Congress in the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The United States had long linked trade with the Soviet Union to its foreign policy toward the Soviet Union, and especially since the early 1980s to Soviet human rights policies. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was attached to the 1974 Trade Act, linked the granting of most favored nation to the USSR to the right of persecuted Soviet Jews to immigrate. Because the Soviet Union refused the right of immigration to Jewish refuseniks, the ability of the president to apply most favored nation trade status to the Soviet Union was restricted. Although President Jimmy Carter tried to place another limit on the arms race with the ASLA II agreement in 1979, his efforts were undermined by the other events that year, including the Iranian Revolution and the Nicaraguan Revolution, which both ousted pro-U.S. governments, and his retaliation against the Soviet coup in Afghanistan in December. The term New Cold War refers to the period of intensive reawakening of Cold War tensions and conflicts in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Tensions greatly increased between the major powers, with both sides becoming more militant. Diggins says, Reagan went all out to fight the Second Cold War by supporting counterinsurgencies in the Third World. Cox says, the intensity of this Second Cold War was as great as its duration was short. In April 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan (PDPA) seized power in Afghanistan in the Tsar Revolution. Within months, opponents of the communist regime launched an uprising in eastern Afghanistan that quickly expanded into a civil war waged by guerrilla mujahideen against government forces countrywide. The Islamic Unity of Afghanistan Mujahideen insurgents received military training and weapons in neighboring Pakistan and China, while the Soviet Union sent thousands of military advisors to support the PDPA. Meanwhile, increasing friction between the competing factions of the PDPA, the dominant Khalq and the more moderate Parcham, resulted in the dismissal of Parchami cabinet members and the arrest of Parchami cabinet members and the arrest of Parchami military officers under the pretext of a Parchami coup. By mid-1979, the United States had started a covert program to assist the Mujahideen. In September 1979, Khalqist President Nur Muhammad Taraki was assassinated in a coup within the PDPI, orchestrated by fellow Hawk member Hafizullah Amin, who assumed the presidency. Distrusted by the Soviets, Amin was assassinated by Soviet Special Forces during Operation Storm 333 in December 1979. Afghan forces suffered major losses during the Soviet operation. 30 Afghan palace guards and over 300 army guards were killed, while another 150 were captured. Two of Amin's sons, an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old, died from shrapnel wounds sustained during the clashes. In the aftermath of the operation, a total of 1,700 Afghan soldiers who surrendered to Soviet forces were taken as prisoners, and the Soviets installed Babrak Karmal, the leader of the PDP, Parcham faction, as Amin's successor. Veterans of the Soviet Union's Alpha Group have stated that Operation Storm 333 was one of the most successful in the unit's history. Documents released following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s revealed that the Soviet leadership believed Amin had secret contacts within the American embassy in Kabul and was capable of reaching an agreement with the United States. However, allegations of Amin colluding with the Americans have been widely discredited. The PDPA was tasked to fill the vacuum and carried out a purge of Amin supporters. Soviet troops were deployed to put Afghanistan under Soviet control with Karmal in more substantial numbers, although the Soviet government did not expect to do most of the fighting in Afghanistan. As a result, however, the Soviets were now directly involved in what had been a domestic war in Afghanistan. Carter responded to the Soviet invasion by withdrawing the SEATO treaty from ratification, imposing embargoes on grain and technology shipments to the USS, and demanding a significant increase in military spending, and further announced the boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, which was joined by 65 other nations. He described the Soviet incursion as the most serious threat to the peace since the Second World War. In January 1977, 4 years prior to becoming president, Ronald Reagan bluntly stated in a conversation with Richard V. Allen his basic expectation in relation to the Cold War. "My idea of American policy toward the Soviet Union is simple, and some would say simple and some would say simplistic," he said. "It is this: we win and they lose. What do you think of that?" In 1980, Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election, vowing to increase military spending and confront the Soviets everywhere. Both Reagan and new British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher denounced the Soviet Union and its ideology. Reagan labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire and predicted that communism would be left on the ash heap of history, while Thatcher inculpated the Soviets as bent on world dominance. In 1982, Reagan tried to cut off Moscow's access to hard currency by impeding its proposed gas line to Western Europe. It hurt the Soviet economy, but it also caused ill will among American allies in Europe, who counted on that revenue. Reagan retreated on this issue. By early 1985, Reagan's anti-communist position had developed into a stance known as the New Reagan Doctrine, which, in addition to containment, formulated an additional right to subvert existing communist governments, besides continuing Carter's policy of supporting the Islamic opponents of the Soviet Union and the Soviet-backed PDP-A government in Afghanistan. The CAA also sought to weaken the Soviet Union itself by promoting Islamism in the majority Muslim Central Asian Soviet Union. Additionally, the CIA encouraged anti-communist Pakistan's ISI to train Muslims from around the world to participate in the jihad against the Soviet Union. Pope John Paul II provided a moral focus for anti-communism. A visit to his native Poland in 1979 stimulated a religious and nationalist resurgence centered on the Solidarity Movement trade union that galvanized opposition and may have led to his attempted assassination 2 years later. In December 1981, Poland's Wojciech Jaruzelski reacted to the crisis by imposing a period of martial law. Reagan imposed economic sanctions on Poland in response. Mikhail Suslov, the Kremlin's top ideologist, advised Soviet leaders not to intervene if Poland fell under the control of Solidarity, for fear it might lead to heavy economic sanctions, resulting in a catastrophe for the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union had built up a military that consumed as much as 25% of its gross national product at the expense of consumer goods and investment in civilian sectors. Soviet spending on the arms race and other Cold War commitments both caused and exacerbated deep-seated structural problems in the Soviet system, which experienced at least a decade of economic stagnation during the late Brezhnev years. Soviet investment in the defense sector was not driven by military necessity, but in large part by the interests of the nomenklatura, which was dependent on the sector for their own power and privileges. The Soviet armed forces became the largest in the world in terms of the numbers and types of weapons they possessed, in the number of troops in their ranks, and in the sheer size of their military-industrial base. However, the quantitative advantages held by the Soviet military often concealed areas where the Eastern Bloc dramatically lagged behind the West. For example, the Persian Gulf War demonstrated how the armor, fire control systems, and firing range of the Soviet Union's most common main battle tank, the T-72, were drastically inferior to the American Mon Abrams, yet the U.S. fielded almost 3 times as many T-72s as the U.S. deployed Mons. By the early 1980s, the USSR had built up a military arsenal and army surpassing that of the United States. Soon after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter began massively building up the United States military. This buildup was accelerated by the Reagan administration, which increased the military spending from 5.3% of GNP in 1981 to 6.5% in 1986, the largest peacetime defense buildup in United States history. The American-Soviet tensions present during 1983 was defined by some as the start of Cold War II. Whilst in retrospective this phase of the Cold War was generally defined as a war of words, the Soviets' peace offensive was largely rejected by the West. Tensions continued to intensify as Reagan revived the B-1 Lancer program, which had been canceled by the Carter administration, produced LGM-118 Peacekeeper missiles, installed U.S. cruise missiles in Europe, and announced the Experimental Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars by the media, a defense program to shoot down missiles in mid-flight. The Soviets deployed RSD-10 Pioneer ballistic missiles targeting Western Europe, and NATO decided under the impetus of the Carter presidency to deploy MGM-31 Pershing and cruise missiles in Europe, primarily West Germany. This deployment placed missiles just 10 minutes striking distance from Moscow. After Reagan's military buildup, the Soviet Union did not respond by further building its military because the enormous military expenses, along with inefficient planned manufacturing and collectivized agriculture, were already a heavy burden for the Soviet economy. At the same time, Saudi Arabia increased oil production, even as other non-OPEC nations were increasing production. These developments contributed to the 1980s oil glut, which affected the Soviet Union as oil was the main source of Soviet export revenues. Issues with command economics, oil price decreases, and large military expenditures gradually brought the Soviet economy to stagnation. On 1 September 1983, the Soviet Union shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7, a Boeing 747 with 269 people aboard, including sitting Congressman Larry McDonald, an action which Reagan characterized as a massacre. The airliner was en route from Anchorage to Seoul, but owing to a navigational mistake made by the crew, it drifted from its original planned route and flew through Russian-prohibited airspace past the west coast of Sakhalin Island near Moneron Island. The Soviet Air Force treated the unidentified aircraft as an intruding U.S. spy plane and destroyed it with air-to-air missiles. The Soviet Union found the wreckage under the sea 2 weeks later, on September 15, and found the flight recorders in October, but this information was kept secret by the Soviet authorities until after the country's collapse. The incident increased support for military deployment overseen by Reagan, which stood in place until the later accords between Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. During the early hours of September 26, 1983, the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident occurred. Systems in Serpukhov-15 underwent a glitch that claimed several intercontinental ballistic missiles were heading towards Russia, but Officer Stanislav Petrov correctly suspected it was a false alarm, ensuring the Soviets did not respond to the non-existent attack. As such, he has been credited as the man who saved the world. The Able Archer 83 exercise in November 1983, a realistic simulation of a coordinated NATO nuclear release, was perhaps the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, as the Soviet leadership feared that a nuclear attack might be imminent. American domestic public concerns about intervening in foreign conflicts persisted from the end of the Vietnam War. The Reagan administration emphasized the use of quick, low-cost counterinsurgency tactics to intervene in foreign conflicts. In 1983, the Reagan administration intervened in the multi-sided Lebanese Civil War, invaded Grenada, bombed Libya, and backed the Central American Contras, anti-communist paramilitaries seeking to overthrow the Soviet-aligned Sandinista government in Nicaragua. While Reagan's interventions against Grenada and Libya were popular in the United States, his backing of the Contra rebels was mired in controversy. The Reagan administration's backing of the military government of Guatemala during the Guatemalan Civil War, in particular the regime of Efrain Rios Montt, was also controversial. Meanwhile, the Soviets incurred high costs for their own foreign interventions. Although Brezhnev was convinced in 1979 that the Soviet war in Afghanistan would be brief, Muslim guerrillas, aided by the US, China, Britain, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, waged a fierce resistance against the invasion. The Kremlin sent nearly 100,000 troops to support its puppet regime in Afghanistan, leading many outside observers to dub the war the Soviets' Vietnam. However, Moscow's quagmire in Afghanistan was far more disastrous for the Soviets than Vietnam had been for the Americans because the conflict coincided with a period of internal decay and domestic crisis in the Soviet system. A senior U.S. State Department official predicted such an outcome as early as 1980, positing that the invasion resulted in part from a domestic crisis within the Soviet system. It may be that the thermodynamic law of entropy has caught up with the Soviet system, which now seems to expend more energy on simply maintaining its equilibrium than on improving itself. We could be seeing a period of foreign movement at a time of internal decay. By the time the comparatively youthful Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, the Soviet economy was stagnant and faced a sharp fall in foreign currency earnings as a result of the downward slide in oil prices in the 1980s. These issues prompted Gorbachev to investigate measures to revive the ailing state. An ineffectual start led to the conclusion that deeper structural changes were necessary, and in June 1987, Gorbachev announced an agenda of economic reform called Perestroika, or restructuring. Perestroika relaxed the production quota system, allowed cooperative ownership of small businesses, and paved the way for foreign investment. These measures were intended to redirect the country's resources from costly Cold War military commitments to more productive areas in the civilian sector. Despite initial skepticism in the West, the new Soviet leader proved to be committed to reversing the Soviet Union's deteriorating economic condition instead of continuing the arms race with the West. Partly as a way to fight off internal opposition from party cliques to his reforms, Gorbachev simultaneously introduced glasnost, or openness, which increased freedom of the press and the transparency of state institutions. Glasnost was intended to reduce the corruption at the top of the Communist Party and moderate the abuse of power in the Central Committee. Glasnost also enabled increased contact between Soviet citizens and the Western world, particularly with the United States, contributing to the accelerating detente between the two nations. In response to the Kremlin's military and political concessions, Reagan agreed to renew talks on economic issues and the scaling back of the arms race. The first summit was held in November 1985 in Geneva, Switzerland. At one stage, the two men, accompanied only by an interpreter, agreed in principle to reduce each country's nuclear arsenal by 50%. A second summit was held in October 1986 in Reykjavik, Iceland. Talks went well until the focus shifted to Reagan's proposed Strategic Defense Initiative, SDIED, SDI, which Gorbachev wanted to be eliminated. Reagan refused. The negotiations failed, but the third summit, Washington Summit, 1987, December 8-10, 1987, led to a breakthrough with the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF. The INF Treaty eliminated all nuclear-armed ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,000, 500 kilometers, 310 and 3,420 mi, and their infrastructure. During 1988, it became apparent to the Soviets that oil and gas subsidies, along with the cost of maintaining massive troops levels, represented a substantial economic drain. In addition, the security advantage of a buffer zone was recognized as irrelevant, and the Soviets officially declared that they would no longer intervene in the affairs of satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe. Bush and Gorbachev met at the Moscow Summit May 29, June 3, 1988, and the Moscow Summit May 29, June 3, 1988, and the Governor's Island Summit December 7, 1988. In 1989, Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan without achieving their objectives. Later that year, the Berlin Wall, the inner German border, and the Iron Curtain fell. On 3 December 1989, Gorbachev and Bush declared the Cold War over at the Malta Summit. In February 1990, Gorbachev agreed with the U.S., proposed treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany, and signed it on 12 September 1990, paving the way for the German reunification. When the Berlin Wall came down, Gorbachev's common European home concept began to take shape. The two former adversaries were partners in the Gulf War against Iraq, August 1990, February 1991. During the final summit in Moscow in July 1991, Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush signed the SEATO, Arms Control Treaty. Two developments dominated the decade that followed: the increasingly apparent crumbling of the Soviet Union's economic and political structures, and the patchwork attempts at reforms to reverse that process. Kenneth S. Defies argued in Beyond Oil that the Reagan administration encouraged Saudi Arabia to lower the price of oil to the point where the Soviets could not make a profit selling their oil, and resulted in the depletion of the country's hard currency reserves. Brezhnev's next two successors, transitional figures with deep roots in his tradition, did not last long. Yuri Andropov was 68 years old and Konstantin Chernenko 72 when they assumed power. Both died in less than 2 years. In an attempt to avoid a third short-lived leader, in 1985 the Soviets turned to the next generation and selected Mikhail Gorbachev. He made significant changes in the economy and party leadership, called perestroika. His policy of glasnost freed public access to information after decades of heavy government censorship. Gorbachev also moved to end the Cold War. In 1988, the USSR abandoned its war in Afghanistan and began to withdraw its forces. In the following year, Gorbachev refused to interfere in the internal affairs of the Soviet satellite states, which paved the way for the revolutions of 1989. In particular, the standstill of the Soviet Union at the Pan-European picnic in August 1989 then set a peaceful chain reaction in motion, at the end of which the Eastern Bloc collapsed. With the tearing down of the Berlin Wall and with East and West Germany pursuing reunification, the Iron Curtain between the West and Soviet occupied regions came down by 1989. The Soviet alliance system was on the brink of collapse, and deprived of Soviet military support, the communist leaders of the Warsaw Pact states were losing power. Grassroots organizations such as Poland's Solidarity Movement rapidly gained ground with strong popular bases. The Pan-European picnic in August 1989 in Hungary finally started a peaceful movement that the rulers in the Eastern Bloc could not stop. It was the largest movement of refugees from East Germany since the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, and ultimately brought about the fall of the Iron Curtain. The patrons of the picnic, Otto von Habsburg, and the Hungarian Minister of State Imre Pozsgay, saw the planned event as an opportunity to test Mikhail Gorbachev's reaction. The Austrian branch of the Pan-European Union, which was then headed by Karl von Habsburg, distributed thousands of brochures inviting the GDR holidaymakers in Hungary to a picnic near the border at Sopron. But with the mass exodus at the Pan-European picnic, the subsequent hesitant behavior of the ruling Socialist Unity Party of East Germany, and the non-interference of the Soviet Union broke the dams. Now tens of thousands of media, informed East Germans made their way to Hungary, which was no longer willing to keep its borders completely closed, or to oblige its border troops to use armed force. On the one hand, this caused disagreement among the Eastern European states, and on the other hand, it was clear to the Eastern European population that the governments no longer had absolute power. In 1989, the communist governments in Poland and Hungary became the first to negotiate the organization of competitive elections. In Czechoslovakia and East Germany, mass protests unseated entrenched communist leaders. The communist regimes in Bulgaria and Romania also crumbled, in the latter case as the result of a violent uprising. Attitudes had changed enough that U.S. Secretary of State James Baker suggested that the American government would not be opposed to Soviet intervention in Romania on behalf of the opposition to prevent bloodshed. The tidal wave of change culminated with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, which symbolized the collapse of European communist governments and graphically ended the Iron Curtain divide of Europe. The 1989 revolutionary wave swept across Central and Eastern Europe and peacefully overthrew all of the Soviet-style Marxist-Leninist states: East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. Romania was the only Eastern Bloc country to topple its communist regime violently and execute its head of state. At the same time, the Soviet republics started legal moves towards potentially declaring sovereignty over their territories, citing the freedom to secede in Article 72 of the USSR Constitution. On 7 April 1990, a law was passed allowing a republic to secede if more than two-thirds of its residents voted for it in a referendum. Many held their first free elections in the Soviet era for their own national legislatures in 1990. Many of these legislatures proceeded to produce legislation contradicting the Union laws in what was known as the War of Laws. In 1989, the Russian SFR convened a newly elected Congress of People's Deputies. Boris Yeltsin was elected its chairman. On 12 June 1990, the Congress declared Russia's sovereignty over its territory and proceeded to pass laws that attempted to supersede some of the Soviet laws. After a landslide victory of Sejudis in Lithuania, that country declared its independence restored on 11 March 1990, citing the illegality of the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. Soviet forces attempted to halt the secession by crushing popular demonstrations in Lithuania, Bloody Sunday, and Latvia, the barricades, as a result of which numerous civilians were killed or wounded. However, these actions only bolstered international support for the secessionists. A referendum for the preservation of the USSR was held on 17 March 1991 in 9 republics, the remainder having boycotted the vote, with the majority of the population in those republics voting for preservation of the Union in the form of a new federation. The referendum gave Gorbachev a minor boost. In the summer of 1991, the new Union Treaty, which would have turned the country into a much looser union, was agreed upon by 8 republics. The signing of the treaty, however, was interrupted by the August coup, an attempted coup d'état by hardline members of the government and the KGB, who sought to reverse Gorbachev's reforms and reassert the central government's control over the republics. After the coup collapsed, Russian President Yeltsin was seen as a hero for his decisive actions, while Gorbachev's power was effectively ended. The balance of power tipped significantly towards the republics. In August 1991, Latvia and Estonia immediately declared the restoration of their full independence, following Lithuania's 1990 example. Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary in late August, and soon afterwards the party's activities were indefinitely suspended, effectively ending its rule. By the fall, Gorbachev could no longer influence events outside Moscow, and he was being challenged even there by Yeltsin, who had been elected president of Russia in July 1991. U.S. President George H.W. Bush expressed his emotions. "The biggest thing that has happened in the world in my life, in our lives, is this. By the grace of God, America won the Cold War." Later in August, Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of the Communist Party, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin ordered the seizure of Soviet property. Gorbachev clung to power as the President of the Soviet Union until 25 December 1991, when the USSR dissolved. 15 states emerged from the Soviet Union, with by far the largest and most populous one, which also was the founder of the Soviet state with the October Revolution in Petrograd, the Russian Federation taking full responsibility for all the rights and obligations of the USSR under the Charter of the United Nations, including the financial obligations. As such, Russia assumed the Soviet Union's UN membership and permanent membership on the Security Council, nuclear stockpile, and the control over the armed forces. Soviet embassies abroad became Russian embassies abroad became Russian embassies. Bush and Yeltsin met in February 1992, declaring a new era of friendship and partnership. In January 1993, Bush and Yeltsin agreed to SEATO, which provided for further nuclear arms reductions on top of the original STAR treaty. In summing up the international ramifications of these events, Vladislav Zubok stated, "The collapse of the Soviet Empire was an event of epochal geopolitical, military, ideological, and economic significance. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia drastically cut military spending and restructuring the economy left millions unemployed. According to Western analysis, the neoliberal reforms in Russia culminated in a recession in the early 1990s, more severe than the Great Depression as experienced by the United States and Germany. Western analysts suggest that in the 25 years following the end of the Cold War, only 5 or 6 of the post-communist states are on a path to joining the rich and capitalist world while most are falling behind, some to such an extent that it will take several decades to catch up to where they were before the collapse of communism. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania consider themselves as revivals of the three independent countries that existed prior to their occupation and annexation by the Soviet Union in 1940. They maintain that the process by which they were incorporated into the Soviet Union violated both international law and their own law, and that in 1990, they were reasserting an independence that still legally existed. Communist parties outside the Baltic states were not outlawed and their members were not prosecuted. Just a few places attempted to exclude members of communist secret services from decision-making. In some countries, the Communist Party changed its name and continued to function. Stephen Holmes of the University of Chicago argued in 1996 that decommunization, after a brief active period, quickly ended in near universal failure. After the introduction of lustration, demand for scapegoats has become relatively low, and former communists have been elected for high governmental and other administrative positions. Holmes notes that the only real exception was former East Germany, where thousands of former Stasi informers have been fired from public positions. Holmes suggests the following reasons for the failure of decommunization. After 70 years of communist rule, nearly every family has members associated with the state. After the initial desire to root out the Reds came a realization that massive punishment is wrong, and finding only some guilty is hardly justice. The urgency of the current economic problems of post-communism makes the crimes of the communist past old news for many citizens. Decommunization is believed to be a power game of elites. The difficulty of dislodging the social elite makes it require a totalitarian state to disenfranchise the enemies of the people quickly and efficiently, and a desire for normalcy overcomes the desire for punitive justice. Very few people have a perfectly clean slate, and so are available to fill the positions that require significant expertise. Compared with the decommunization efforts of the other former constituents of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, decommunization in Russia has been restricted to half measures, if conducted at all. Notable anti-communist measures in the Russian Federation include the banning of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the creation of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, as well as changing the names of some Russian cities back to what they were before the 1917 October Revolution. Leningrad to St. Petersburg, Sverdlovsk to Yekaterinburg, and Gorky to Nizhny Novgorod, though others were maintained, with Ulyanovsk, former Simbirsk, Tolyatti, former Sevastopol, and Kirov, former Stavropol, and Kirov, former Vyatka, being examples. Even though Leningrad and Sverdlovsk were renamed, regions that were named after them are still officially called Leningrad and Sverdlovsk oblasts. Nostalgia for the Soviet Union is gradually on the rise in Russia. Communist symbols continue to form an important part of the rhetoric used in state-controlled media, as banning on them in other countries is seen by the Russian Foreign Ministry as sacrilege, and a perverse idea of good and evil. The process of decommunization in Ukraine, a neighboring post-Soviet state, was met with fierce criticism by Russia, who regularly dismisses Soviet war crimes. The state anthem of the Russian Federation, adopted in 2000, the same year Vladimir Putin began his first term as president of Russia, uses the exact same music as the state anthem of the Soviet Union, but with new lyrics written by Sergei Mikhalkov. Conversely, decommunization in Ukraine started during and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990. With the success of the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, the Ukrainian government approved laws that outlawed communist symbols. On 15 May 2015, President of Ukraine Petro Poroshenko signed a set of laws that started a 6-month period for the removal of communist monuments, excluding World War II monuments, and renaming of public places named after communist-related themes. At the time, this meant that 22 cities and 44 villages were set to get new names. Until 21 November 2015, municipal governments had the authority to implement this. If they failed to do so, the oblasts of Ukraine had until 21 May 2016 to change the names. If after that date the settlement had retained its old name, the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine would wield authority to assign a new name to the settlement. In 2016, 51,493 streets and 987 cities and villages were renamed, and 1320 Lenin monuments and 1069 monuments to other communist figures removed. Violation of the law carries a penalty of a potential media ban and prison sentences of up to 5 years. On 24 July 2015, the Ministry of the Interior stripped the Communist Party of Ukraine, renewed, and the Communist Party of Ukraine, renewed, and the Communist Party of Workers and Peasants of their right to participate in elections, and stated it was continuing the court actions that started in July 2014 to end the registration of communist parties in Ukraine. By 16 December 2015, these three parties had been banned in Ukraine. The Communist Party of Ukraine appealed the ban to the European Court of Human Rights, meaning the court's decision to ban the party did not come into force. The April 2015 decommunization law contains a norm that allows the Ministry of Justice to prohibit the party from participating in elections. The Cold War continues to influence world affairs. The post-Cold War world is considered to be unipolar, with the United States the sole remaining superpower. The Cold War defined the political role of the United States after World War II. By 1989, the United States had military alliances with 50 countries, with 526,000 troops stationed abroad, with 326,000 in Europe, thirds of which were in West Germany, and 130,000 in Europe, and 130,000 in Asia, mainly Japan and South Korea. The Cold War also marked the zenith of peacetime military-industrial complexes, especially in the Soviet Union and the United States, and large-scale military funding of science. These complexes, though their origins may be found as early as the 19th century, snowballed considerably during the Cold War. Cumulative U.S. military expenditures throughout the entire Cold War amounted to an estimated $8 trillion. Further, nearly 100,000 Americans died in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Although Soviet casualties are difficult to estimate, as a share of gross national product, the financial cost for the Soviet Union was much higher than that incurred by the United States. In addition to the loss of life by uniformed soldiers, millions died in the superpowers' proxy wars around the globe, most notably in Eastern Asia. Most of the proxy wars and subsidies for local conflicts ended along with the Cold War. Interstate wars, ethnic wars, revolutionary wars, as well as refugee and displaced persons crises have declined sharply in the post-Cold War years. However, the aftermath of the Cold War is not considered to be concluded. Many of the economic and social tensions that were exploited to fuel Cold War competition in parts of the Third World remain acute. The breakdown of state control in a number of areas formerly ruled by communist governments produced new civil and ethnic conflicts, particularly in the former Yugoslavia. In Central and Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War has ushered in an era of economic growth and an increase in the number of liberal democracies, while in other parts of the world, such as Afghanistan, independence was accompanied by state failure. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in propaganda designed to influence people around the world, especially using motion pictures. The Cold War endures as a popular topic reflected extensively in entertainment media and continuing to the present with numerous post-1991 Cold War-themed feature films, novels, television, and other media. In 2013, AKGB Sleeper Agents Living Next Door action drama series The Americans, set in the early 1980s, was ranked No. 6 on the Metacritic annual Best New TV Shows list. Its 6 Asian run concluded in May 2018. As soon as the term Cold War was popularized to refer to post-war tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, interpreting the course and origins of the conflict has been a source of heated controversy among historians, political scientists, and journalists. In particular, historians have sharply disagreed as to who was responsible for the breakdown of Soviet-U.S. relations after the Second World War, and whether the conflict between the two superpowers was inevitable or could have been avoided. Historians have also disagreed on what exactly the Cold War was, what the sources of the conflict were, and how to disentangle patterns of action and reaction between the two sides. Although explanations of the origins of the conflict in academic discussions are complex and diverse, several general schools of thought on the subject can be identified. Historians commonly speak of three different approaches to the study of the Cold War: orthodox accounts, revisionism, and post-revisionism. Orthodox accounts place responsibility for the Cold War on the Soviet Union and its expansion further into Europe. Revisionist writers place more responsibility for the breakdown of post-war peace on the United States, citing a range of U.S. efforts to isolate and confront the Soviet Union well before the end of World War II. Post-revisionists see the events of the Cold War as more nuanced and attempt to be more balanced in determining what occurred during the Cold War. Much of the historiography on the Cold War weaves together two or even all three of these broad categories.